They didn't even slow down. That was the part that broke something inside her, not the stopping, not the argument, not the wagon master's cold eyes when he told her she had until sunrise to figure out her situation. It was the not slowing down. The wheels kept turning, one after another, 12 wagons rolling west like she was nothing more than a rock they'd driven around, and not a single person looked back. Not the women she'd shared meals with for 6 weeks. Not the families she'd helped when their children were sick. Not one face turned to see a 24-year-old woman standing alone on the Montana prairie, with a 6-month-old baby pressed against her chest and a cracked trunk at her feet that held everything she owned in this world. The dust settled slowly. Then there was just wind. If you've ever been left somewhere and felt the particular silence of people who chose to keep going, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Leave a comment with your city and country. I want to know how far this story travels. Like this video if you believe some people deserve better than what the world gives them, because this one does. The wagon's master's name was Gerald Pruitt, and he had decided Amelia Whitmore was a problem 3 days outside of Fort Benton. It wasn't her fault, not truly, though Pruitt told himself otherwise, because men like him always needed a reason that wasn't their own cowardice. The real problem was that Amelia's intended a rancher named Thomas Whitmore, no relation she'd known of before the arrangement was made, had sent word ahead that he was withdrawing from the agreement. The letter reached Pruitt at the last supply post, written in a careful hand and apologetic in tone, explaining that circumstances had changed and he could no longer accept the arrangement. Circumstances. Pruitt had read that word 4 times before he understood what it meant. Whitmore had learned about the baby. Someone in the agency back in St. Louis had let it slip, or Whitmore had asked the right questions, and now the man who had agreed to take a wife off a mail-order arrangement had decided that a wife who came with another man's child was not the wife he'd bargained for. He offered no compensation. He sent no alternate arrangement. He simply withdrew, the way a man cancels an order for boots that arrived in the wrong size. Pruitt had held on to the letter for 2 days before he told Amelia. He waited until the wagon train was too far from any outpost to reasonably turn back. He waited until the landscape around them had opened into the kind of emptiness that makes a person feel small and stupid for thinking they had any power over their own situation. He waited, in other words, until she had no options. Then he called her to the front of the line. Amelia came carrying Ethan, because she always carried Ethan. Baby was 6 months old and had his mother's dark eyes and a serious expression that made him look like he was already trying to figure out the world around him. She'd wrapped him in a piece of flannel she'd sewn herself during the long evenings on the trail, and he was awake and quiet against her shoulder, watching everything with that particular infant focus that suggested he understood more than he should. Mrs. Whitmore, Pruitt said, which was already a bad sign, because he'd been calling her Miss Amelia for 6 weeks. Stopped. Shifted Ethan's weight, Mr. Pruitt. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't take off his hat. He just handed her the letter. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, because the first time she thought she must have misunderstood something. Her eyes went to the bottom of the page, to the signature, to the date, and then she folded it along its original creases and held it against her palm. When did this come? She asked. 2 days back. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. You waited 2 days. Pruitt had the grace to look away, but only briefly. Needed time to assess the situation. The situation, she repeated. You're not contracted anymore, Mrs. Whitmore. The arrangement's been canceled. I can't carry non-contracted passengers. That was the agreement from the start. The words were so reasonable and so terrible at the same time that Amelia stood there for a moment, unable to speak, which wasn't like her. She was not a woman who lost words easily. She'd been losing them a lot lately, though ever since Ethan's father had disappeared 8 months ago, ever since she'd sold the last of what they owned in St. Louis to pay for passage west, ever since she'd signed her name to a contract with a stranger, because a stranger with a ranch was better than a city that had already decided she didn't belong anywhere in it. I have nowhere to go, she said. Not pleading. Just stating a fact. There's a settlement 3 days east, Pruitt said. Could make it on foot in 5, maybe 6 days if the weather holds. I have a 6-month-old baby. I understand that. Do you? The words came out flat and cold, and Pruitt had the sense to hear what was underneath them, because he took a small step back. But he didn't change his answer. He was the kind of man who had already made his decision and dressed it up in policy so he didn't have to look at what it really was. I'm sorry, said, but I have 12 families depending on this wagon train. I can't jeopardize the whole group for one passenger. You're not jeopardizing anything. You're leaving a woman and an infant in the wilderness. I'm following the terms of the agreement. She could have argued longer. She thought about it. But she looked at his face and understood something that women on the frontier understood faster than men ever admitted, that some arguments were already over before they started, and the only thing left was to figure out how to survive the outcome. She took Ethan back to her wagon. She packed what she could carry. She didn't ask any of the other women for help because she could already see in their faces the particular combination of pity and relief that meant they were glad it wasn't them. And she didn't want that from anyone. The trunk was too heavy to move far, so she dragged it 10 feet off the trail and sat on it. She waited until the wagons were out of sight. Then she let herself be afraid. For exactly 5 minutes, she counted, roughly in her head, because 5 minutes was all she could afford. Ethan fussed. She adjusted him, pressed her lips to his forehead, checked that his blanket was tucked properly around his feet. The wind was picking up from the north, and she could smell rain in it, which meant tonight would be cold. The prairie stretched out in every direction, with the particular indifference of landscape that doesn't care whether you live or die in it. She had half a canteen of water, a small cloth bag with dried biscuits, and a handful of jerked beef. The flannel blanket Ethan was wrapped in, and 2 extra diapers she'd folded into the top of the trunk before it got too heavy to take anything else from it. She had never been this afraid in her life. She had also never let fear make decisions for her. Amelia Whitmore had grown up in a house where survival was something you did every day without being praised for it. Her mother had raised 3 children on a seamstress income after her father broke his back in a mill accident. There was no money for excess, no patience for self-pity, and no use for women who couldn't figure out what to do with their hands. By the time Amelia was 12, she could cook a meal from almost nothing and stretch fabric that should have covered 1 dress into 2. By the time she was 20, she could manage a household, handle money, and read a person's real intentions in the first 3 minutes of conversation. None of that felt like much, sitting on a broken trunk in the Montana wilderness. But she didn't have anything else. She stood up, adjusted Ethan on her hip, and started walking east. The settlement Pruitt mentioned was real. She'd seen it on the map he kept pinned to the front of his wagon, and she had a decent memory for distances. 3 days by wagon meant roughly 30 miles. On foot with a baby and no pack animal and no way to carry more than what she had in her arms, it was closer to 6 days. She had water for 2. She walked for about an hour before the first real fear hit her, not the manageable kind, not the kind she could argue herself through, but the deep, physical fear that comes when the body understands something the mind hasn't fully accepted yet. She was going to run out of water tomorrow. Ethan was too young for solid food and completely dependent on her, which meant her own health was not just her concern. If she got sick, he died. If she got too weak to carry him, he died. If a storm hit tonight and they had no shelter, there was a real possibility they both did not survive the next 48 hours. She stopped walking. She sat down in the grass and held Ethan against her chest and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and the fear got big. In, out, again. Ethan patted her cheek with one small hand, which was something he'd started doing recently, reaching for her face like he was checking to make sure she was still there. Caught his hand and held it. "We're going to be fine," she told him, which was something she believed about 40% of the time, and said because the other 60% needed something to hold on to. She was still sitting there when she heard the horse. She didn't stand up right away. That was the first thing. Wyatt Callahan noticed that the woman didn't jump up and wave at him like most people in trouble did. The ones who'd been sitting in their fear long enough that any rider on the horizon looked like salvation. She heard him. He could tell by the way her head turned. But she stayed where she was, one hand behind her like she was bracing for something, and she watched him come toward her with an expression he couldn't quite read at the distance. Wyatt had been riding since before dawn. He was heading north toward a ranch he'd agreed to work through the fall, a decision he'd made, mostly because he needed the income, and partly because he'd been drifting for 3 years, and some part of him was tired of it without being ready to admit that out loud. He was 31 years old and had been on the frontier for most of a decade, first as a cavalry scout and then as whatever useful work he could find, which in his experience was usually the kind of work other men didn't want to do. He saw the wagons about 2 miles back, 12 of them, moving west at the standard pace, nobody stopping, nobody looking behind them. He didn't think much of it until he got closer to where they'd passed and saw the woman and the baby. He pulled up about 30 feet away, which was far enough to be polite and close enough to see her face clearly. She was younger than he'd expected, not a girl. There was nothing girlish in her expression but young, dark hair coming loose from a braid. A baby pressed against her shoulder that was watching him with the unnerving attentiveness of very young children who haven't learned yet that staring is rude. A busted trunk sat behind her in the grass. "You with those wagons?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I was," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. He'd expected crying or anger or the particular brittle calm of someone about to fall apart. He got none of those. She sounded like a woman answering a factual question about the weather. "They leave you behind?" That appears to be the case. He looked at the trunk, at the canteen sitting beside it, at the baby who had apparently decided Wyatt was interesting and was now craning its neck to keep him in view. "How long you been sitting here?" "About an hour." "Where are you trying to get?" She told him about the settlement to the east. She gave him the approximate distance and her estimate of how long it would take on foot and, without being asked, a calm rundown of her supplies. Half a canteen, food for maybe a day and a half if she was careful, 2 extra diapers, the blanket. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he said, "That settlement's closer to 40 miles. Something moved in her face, not panic, more like a fast internal recalculation. "Changes the math." "Yeah," he said, "it does." He sat on his horse for a moment, thinking about his own situation, which was that he was 3 days from the ranch where he's supposed to arrive and already behind schedule. Practical thing, the reasonable thing was to offer her what water he could spare, make sure she understood the actual distance, and continue north. That was what a sensible man did. There were hard choices on the frontier, and this was one of them. He looked at the baby again. The baby looked back at him. Wyatt got off his horse. "I'm not looking for charity," she said immediately. And there was something in her voice that told him this wasn't the first time she'd had to say it, that she'd been saying versions of it for a while now, to different people, for different reasons. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm Wyatt Callahan. I'm a ranch hand, and I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry before that. I know this territory." He crouched down to be less tall, which people often found less threatening, and looked at her directly. "What's your name?" A pause. "Amelia Whitmore. The baby?" "Ethan." She adjusted the infant without looking away from Wyatt. 6 months, I can see that." He glanced around at the landscape, at the sky to the north, where the clouds were thickening into something with weather in them. Then he looked back at her. "There's rain coming tonight. Probably before dark. The temperature's going to drop with it." She said nothing. She already knew. "There's a creek about 2 miles north of here," he said. "Clean water, some tree cover. Not much, but enough to make a camp that doesn't kill you overnight." He paused. "My north is not your east. I know that. But east right now, with what you have in weather coming in." He stopped. He wasn't going to finish that sentence, because finishing it out loud would only make her feel worse, and she clearly already understood the mathematics of it. "I can take you north tonight, get you out of this weather. Tomorrow I'll figure out how to get you somewhere that isn't a 2-day walk through open prairie." She studied him for a long time. Wyatt had been studied by a lot of people over the years. He'd grown up in a family where trust was something you earned slowly, and suspicion was a reasonable baseline, and he recognized the same calculation happening behind her eyes. She was looking for the angle, looking for what he wanted. "Why?" she asked finally. It was a fair question. Thought about giving her a practical answer. Something about it being the decent thing, or the right thing, the kind of answer that sounded reasonable and let everyone get moving without too much examination. But he looked at her face and decided she would see through that. "Because you're sitting in the middle of the Montana territory with a 6-month-old baby and supplies for one day," he said. "And I have the ability to help, and I'd rather be the kind of man who does that than the kind who doesn't." Another pause. Longer this time. "That's either a very honest answer," she said, "or a very good lie." "I know so," he said. "You're going to have to decide which." He didn't push it. He stood up and walked back to his horse and began checking the saddle cinch, giving her the space to think without him looming over her. He'd meant what he said, both parts of it. He couldn't make her trust him, and he wouldn't try. But he wasn't going anywhere until she'd had the chance to make an actual choice. He heard her stand up behind him. "I can't carry the trunk," she said. "I know. There are things in it I need. Tell me what they are and I'll see what I can fit." She walked to the trunk and opened it. She went through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been deciding what was worth keeping for a long time. She pulled out a coat, 2 dresses rolled tight, a small case with medical supplies, bandages, A brown bottle, he guessed, was laudanum, a needle and thread, a book, a folded paper that might have been a map or might have been a letter. She held that one for a moment longer than the rest. "You can leave the book," he said, not unkindly. She put it back. Then she held the paper. "Keep it," he said before she could decide. "Whatever it is." She tucked it into the coat pocket. He took the small case and the clothes and worked them into his saddlebags with more success than he'd expected. Traveling light had made him good at fitting things. When he was done, he checked his canteen, which was full, and handed it to her without comment. Took it, drank, then wet the corner of Ethan's blanket and wiped his face with it. The automatic care of a mother, measuring everyone else's needs before her own. "North," she said. "North," he agreed. He helped her onto the horse, a process complicated by the fact that she was holding a baby and didn't want to let go of him, and the horse was not particularly enthusiastic about any of it, and then he took the reins and walked beside them. Because the horse could carry her and the baby more easily without his weight added. They didn't talk much in the first hour. The wind picked up from the north, and she hunched forward slightly to keep Ethan out of the worst of it, and Wyatt picked up the pace without saying anything about it. Clouds were moving faster than he'd originally calculated. He had maybe 2 hours before the rain hit. They made the creek with about 40 minutes to spare. Making a camp with nothing and no time was a skill. Wyatt had built over years of doing exactly that, and he went about it without drama, finding the best tree cover, getting the horse settled, building a fire in a hollow that would keep the wind from killing it. Amelia put Ethan down in a sheltered spot and didn't ask for instructions. She gathered what dry wood she could find before the rain hit, moving with the quick practicality of someone who had done useful things in cold weather before. He noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. The rain came down hard for about an hour, and they sat under the best shelter the trees offered, which was imperfect but functional. Ethan, apparently unimpressed by the whole situation, went to sleep. Amelia sat with her back against a tree and ate some of the jerky she'd brought, and Wyatt cooked the small amount of rice he had in his pack over the fire, and they split it without ceremony. "Where were you headed?" she asked eventually. "Ranch north of here." "Callahan, no, not mine. Hennessy's. I'm working through the fall. And now I'm figuring that out." She looked at him sideways. "You could have kept going." "Yes, most men would have." "Probably," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to be a problem for you. I want you to understand that. I can work, I can cook, I can sew, I can help with whatever needs doing. I'm not going to sit and wait to be taken care of. I didn't think you were. I just wanted to be clear." "You were clear." She looked like she'd been expecting an argument and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the lack of one. She turned back to the fire. The rain was easing off, going from hard to steady, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees with it. "Ethan's father," she said, and stopped. Wyatt said nothing, just waited. "He left before Ethan was born. I'm not going to explain it more than that. You don't have to. I want you to know that I didn't come west without thinking about it. I had a plan. The plan didn't work." She paused. "I'm not a woman who makes bad plans usually. This one was bad. Plans on the frontier usually are," Wyatt said. "It's not a criticism. It's just how it is out here. Nothing goes the way you expect it." She looked at him again, that same direct look she'd had when he first rode up, measuring something. "You sound like you've had a few bad plans yourself." "More than a few," he said. She almost smiled. "It wasn't quite there, but the shape of it was. The ranch I was supposed to go to," she said, "Whitmore's. The man who canceled the arrangement." "You don't have to. I want to say it out loud at least once," she said. "So it doesn't just sit in my head being large." She looked at the fire. "Found out about Ethan. Before I arrived. Someone told him. So he canceled it, and he told the wagon master, and the wagon master waited until we were far enough out that turning me around wasn't practical." Wyatt said nothing, because there wasn't anything useful to say. The facts were what they were. "The wagon master's name is Gerald Pruitt," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, not anger, not exactly, but the sound of a name being filed somewhere for later. "He waited 2 days to tell me." Wyatt had met men like Pruitt, had ridden with some of them in the cavalry, where the capacity for paperwork-level cruelty, the kind that hid behind rules and contracts and reasonable-sounding explanations, was a particular talent that some men had and others didn't. He didn't say any of this. "For what it's worth," he said instead, "you're alive and the baby's alive, and you made it through tonight. That's not nothing." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It isn't." Ethan stirred in his sleep, made a small sound, and settled again. Amelia leaned slightly toward him without quite moving. The The constant unconscious monitoring of a mother tracking the breathing of her child. Wyatt fed another piece of wood to the fire. They sat in the near silence of rain going lighter against the trees, and the fire cracking, and the horse shifting its weight somewhere in the dark behind them, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when two people who are strangers have been through something together and aren't strangers in quite the same way anymore. In the morning, he said finally, we'll figure out what's north. She nodded. In the morning, she agreed. But morning came with its own problem. Wyatt woke before dawn the way he always did, some internal mechanism that had been wound tight by years of cavalry patrols, and sleeping with one ear open, and he lay still for a moment taking stock of things. The rain had stopped. The fire had burned down to coals that still had some heat in them. The horse was fine. Amelia was sitting awake across the dead fire, Ethan in her arms, and her face was doing something Wyatt had not seen it do before. She was frightened. Not the manageable kind, not the kind she'd been carrying the day before with such particular discipline. This was something else. Her eyes went to him the moment he moved, and he saw the relief in them, which told him she'd been awake for a while and had been waiting for him to wake up. What? He said, sitting up. She tilted her head slightly to the north. He listened. Horses. More than one. Moving slowly, the deliberate slowness of people who were trying not to be heard, which was its own kind of noise if you knew what to listen for. Wyatt was on his feet and had his rifle in hand before she'd finished the gesture. Stay down, he said quiet. Stay low, stay behind the trees. Who? I don't know yet. He moved to the edge of the tree cover and looked north. Pre-dawn light was the kind that made distances. Difficult things were there, but not quite resolved into shapes yet. But he could make out 3 riders about 200 yards out. They were moving parallel to the creek, and they had the relaxed posture of men who felt they owned the territory they were moving through. He knew that posture. He'd seen it before, and it had never meant anything good. He went back to Amelia, 3 men, moving along the creek. He looked at her directly. When I tell you to move, you move. You don't wait for an explanation. You move. She held his gaze. I understand. Take the horse's reins. If I tell you to ride, you ride east. Don't look back. What about Ethan stays with you? Obviously. He said it quickly but not unkindly, because she needed to hear it. You don't put him down. You ride east and you don't stop. She nodded once. Then she stood, adjusted Ethan, and went to the horse. Wyatt moved back to the trees. The 3 riders had stopped about 100 yards out. They were talking among themselves. He couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the rhythm of it, the back and forth that sounded like decision-making. One of them pointed toward the tree line, toward the coals. They'd seen the smoke. He weighed his options with the speed of someone who'd had to do that kind of weighing in short amounts of time. He could stay quiet and hope they moved on, but men who were deliberately moving at this hour along a creek bed in this territory were not the kind who moved on without checking. He could wait until they came into the trees and confront them then, but in the trees with a woman and a baby, he had no room to maneuver. Or he could go out to meet them, which gave him the landscape and the choice of where to stand. He walked out of the trees. The 3 men saw him immediately. Their horses stopped. Wyatt kept walking until he was 40 yards out, close enough to be seen clearly, far enough to give himself options, and then he stopped and stood with his rifle in the crook of his arm, not raised, not threatening, just present. Morning, he called. A pause. Then one of the riders nudged his horse forward a few steps. Morning, the man called back. Your camp? It is. Traveling alone? Passing through, Wyatt said, moving north. The rider who'd spoken glanced back at the other 2. Some communication happened between them that Wyatt couldn't see clearly at this distance. We're out of Billings, the man said. Moving some cattle east. Don't see any cattle, Wyatt said. Another pause. Longer. Not today, the man said. Tomorrow. The other 2 had spread slightly apart, not dramatically. The kind of casual repositioning that could be innocent. Could be. You have a good journey then, Wyatt said. He didn't move. He just looked at them, steady and without particular expression, and let the rifle do the work it was doing without being raised. Standoff lasted about 30 seconds. Then the lead rider pulled his horse around, said something to the others, and all 3 moved north at a pace that was slightly faster than they'd arrived. Wyatt watched until they were out of sight. Then he waited another 10 minutes before going back to the trees. Amelia was standing at the horse's head with one hand on the reins, and Ethan on her hip and her eyes on him the moment he came back through. Who were they? Nothing good, he said. But they moved on. He began breaking camp with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time when time was the resource. We're going to move too. Now, not after breakfast. She didn't argue. She started helping him break camp before he'd finished the sentence. That was the moment, though he wouldn't have named it, at the time when something shifted. It wasn't dramatic and it wasn't clean. It was just the small specific knowledge, filed away without ceremony. She was not going to be a problem. She had said it the night before, and he'd heard it, but hearing and knowing were different things. He knew it now. Wyatt loaded the saddlebags and helped her back onto the horse. Ethan, awake now and apparently unconcerned by any of the previous hour's events, regarded the whole process with the same serious attention he gave everything. "North," Amelia said when they were ready to move. "North," Wyatt said. He took the reins and started walking, and the horse followed, and Amelia held Ethan against her chest and kept her eyes on the trail ahead. And none of them looked back at the cold fire or the broken trunk or the wagon ruts heading west in the dried mud of the trail. There was nothing back there worth looking at. The first full day of travel taught them things about each other that conversation wouldn't have. Wyatt learned that Amelia had been underestimated so often that she'd developed a particular efficiency. She did things without announcing them and without waiting to be asked, because she'd spent enough time around people who would talk her out of being useful if she gave them the chance. She found the watercress growing along the creek before he pointed it out and added it to the midday food without commentary. When the horse threw a shoe around noon, not all the way off, but loose enough to matter, she held the animal steady while Wyatt worked, talking to it quietly in a tone that the horse found, apparently, acceptable. She learned that Wyatt moved with the particular patience of a man who had been afraid in dangerous situations enough times that it no longer disrupted his thinking. Assessed things methodically and without visible alarm. He knew the country well enough that he never fully stopped reading it. She could see his eyes moving, even when the rest of him was still, cataloging things she didn't know how to name yet. He didn't explain much, but he also didn't condescend. And when she asked a direct question, he gave a direct answer script, which was rarer than it should have been. They made reasonable progress, not the pace they could have made without a baby, and one horse between two adults, but real progress. By mid-afternoon, they'd covered enough ground that the creek the three riders had been following was far behind them. Ethan had a bad hour around the time the sun was going down, hungry and tired, and registering both complaints at full volume, and Amelia dealt with it without apology and without drama, which Wyatt found himself admiring in a way he didn't fully examine. He'd been around women with infants before. Some treated them like delicate things that required constant commentary. Amelia treated Ethan like a person who was experiencing a temporary difficulty and would feel better once the practical needs were met, which was, in Wyatt's opinion, about the right approach to most problems. They made camp in a shallow valley, better sheltered than the previous night, and Wyatt built a better fire, this time not reckless, but real. He had enough food for a proper meal. Amelia had Ethan asleep by the time the food was ready, which he suspected required a specific kind of skill he would never fully understand. "Tell me about the ranch," she said while they ate. "Hennessy's? It's a working cattle operation. About 40 men in the busy season. Is there room?" she said, it carefully. Not the careful of embarrassment, the careful of someone being precise about something important. "For someone who can work." He looked at her across the fire. "You're thinking about settling there." "I'm thinking about what comes next," she said. "I'm not going to keep depending on your direction indefinitely. I need a plan. The settlement I mentioned is a week east on foot, which we've established isn't a real option with Ethan." She wasn't arguing with him. She was thinking through it in front of him, which was something he'd noticed she did thought out loud, without performance, just working through the problem. A working ranch with 40 men needs someone to cook. So, both, probably. Hennessy's got a cook. Does he need a second one? Wyatt thought about it honestly. He might. It's a big operation. Then that's worth asking about. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to advocate for me. I'm asking if it's a reasonable thing to pursue." "It's a reasonable thing to pursue," he said. She nodded as if that settled something. Then she looked at the fire. "I keep trying to figure out what I should have done differently," she said. "Not tonight, not this trip. The whole thing, the arrangement. Coming west in. I can't find it," she said, "the mistake. I mean, I can see 100 small things I could have done differently. But the big one, the coming west, the arrangement, I'm not sure I had better options." "Probably didn't," Wyatt said. She looked at him, surprised. He thought, by the bluntness of it. "Women in your situation back east don't have a lot of directions to go," he said. "West is hard, but it's at least possible. You made a reasonable decision with incomplete information. That's not the same as making a mistake. A long pause. That is a remarkably practical thing to say, she said. I'm a practical person. I'm beginning to see that, she said. And this time the almost smile was closer to the real thing. Wyatt looked at the fire and did not examine what he was thinking, because he had enough to manage without adding to the list. What he thought, if he'd been pressed to name it, was that he was not a man who was easily surprised. Amelia Whitmore had surprised him 3 times in 2 days. He didn't know what to do with that yet, but he kept it, filed it away with the other things he was carrying, and sat by the fire until the night settled fully around them, and the frontier stretched out beyond the firelight with all its indifference and all its possibility. And somewhere in the east, 12 wagons kept rolling west without looking back. They had left something behind. They just didn't know yet what it was going to become. The 3rd day started with a problem Wyatt hadn't planned for. The horse was favoring its right front leg. Not dramatically, not the way a broken animal favors a leg, all sweat and panic, but with the subtle shifts of something that had been building quietly, and finally made itself known when he checked the animal at first light. He ran his hand down the leg slowly, feeling for heat, and found it above the knee. Not a break, not the thrown shoe from yesterday, which he'd managed to reseat with a flat rock and some patience. Something muscular, the kind of soreness that came from too much weight over too many miles on terrain that wasn't forgiving. Stood up and looked at the animal for a moment without speaking. Amelia was awake behind him. He'd heard her moving before dawn, the quiet sounds of a woman managing an infant's morning needs without waking anyone else. And now she came to stand beside him and looked at the leg. She didn't ask, she waited. He can walk, Wyatt said, but he can't carry 2 and a baby in the gear. Not today. She absorbed this. Options: we walk. Take turns with Ethan. Cover less ground. How much less? Maybe half what we've been making. She looked north at the empty country in front of them. Then she looked at the horse. Is he going to get worse? Not if we don't push him. Then we walk, she said, and went back to breaking camp. That was all. No argument, no negotiation, no asking him to reconsider. He had handed her a problem and she had processed it and moved on. And Wyatt thought again about the word he kept not using when he thought about her, because it felt too large and too simple at the same time. The word was capable. He'd been around capable people. Cowboys who could ride anything. Scouts who could read terrain like a page of text. But Amelia's capability had a different quality. It was the capability of someone who had never had the luxury of being anything else. They loaded the saddlebags onto the horse and walked. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Montana autumn morning that was almost beautiful in its ruthlessness. The sky was enormous, and the grass had that particular pale gold color that meant winter was already thinking about arriving. Wyatt carried Ethan for the first stretch, which required more negotiation than he'd expected, not from Amelia, who handed the baby over with only a brief moment of hesitation, but from Ethan himself, who found this new arrangement objectionable and expressed his opinion on the matter with some force. He doesn't like strange people, Amelia said, I noticed. Give him your finger. Wyatt offered his index finger, and Ethan grabbed it with both hands and held on, with a grip that Wyatt found genuinely surprising for something that small. The crying stopped. Ethan looked up at him with the solemn attention he gave everything, apparently reassessing. That works? Wyatt said. For about 10 minutes, Amelia said. It worked for 20. They fell into a rhythm, Wyatt carrying Ethan when she needed the rest. Amelia taking him back when Wyatt needed both hands to manage the horse over rough ground, both of them moving through the morning without much talk. Wyatt had spent a lot of years traveling alone, and he thought he knew the difference between comfortable silence and the other kind. He was finding out that he'd been measuring it wrong. Comfortable silence, it turned out, had a texture to it, a sense of 2 people who had reached some agreement about each other that didn't require constant maintenance. This was that kind. Around mid-morning, they found a problem that had nothing to do with the horse. Wyatt stopped at the top of a low rise and looked down at the creek crossing below them. The rain 2 nights ago had done more than chill the air. It had pushed the creek up, not to flood, but to something wider and faster than a sensible person would cross without thinking about it carefully. Amelia came up beside him and looked. How deep? Hard to say from here. You've crossed it before? Not at this level. He studied the water, the way it moved, the color of it, the places where it ran white over rocks. There was a crossing about 50 yards upstream that looked shallower, but the bank on the other side was steep. Downstream was muddier, but more gradual. Downstream safer. More ground on the other side. What about the horse? Horse will be fine either way. He looked at her. She was holding Ethan, who had gone quiet in the past few minutes in the particular way that suggested sleep was coming. You can ride across. I'll lead the horse, and if he slips, he won't. You just said you haven't crossed at this level. I said I haven't crossed this specific creek at this level. Crossed a lot of creeks. He won't slip. She looked at him sideways, and he could see her, deciding how much certainty to give his certainty. It was a fair question. He was asking her to trust his judgment about something she couldn't verify herself. Downstream, she said finally. They picked their way down the bank. Wyatt put Amelia and a sleeping Ethan on the horse carefully, slowly, giving her time to get settled before he touched the reins, and then he walked into the water. It was cold enough to pull the breath out of him, knee-deep and moving with more intention than it looked from above, the kind of current that was always slightly stronger than expected. He kept one hand on the horse's bridle and waited, feeling the bottom carefully with each step, and the horse moved through it with the unhurried reliability of an animal that had done this enough times to understand the process. Amelia held Ethan against her chest with one arm and the saddle horn with the other, and said nothing for the entire crossing. But when they reached the other bank and Wyatt helped her down, her hand was shaking, just slightly. Just for a moment, she saw him notice it. I can't swim, she said. He hadn't known that. Why didn't you? Because you said he wouldn't slip. He looked at her. She looked back. He didn't know what expression he was wearing, but whatever it was made her look away first. Next time, he said, tell me. Next time I will, she said. The trouble arrived in the early afternoon, when the sun was at its most direct, and the cold of the morning had eased into something almost warm. There were 4 of them this time. Wyatt heard them before he saw them, the particular sound of horses, moving fast over dry ground, coming from the southwest, from the direction of a ridgeline they'd skirted an hour back. He had time to take stock. They were in a shallow depression, open on 3 sides, with the creek about a quarter mile behind them, and nothing useful ahead. The horse was loaded, Amelia was on foot, Ethan on her hip. Not good ground. He would have chosen different ground, but he hadn't been given the chance. 4 riders came over the low rise to the southwest and pulled up when they saw him. For a moment, everyone just looked at everyone else. Then the lead rider, big man, unkempt, wearing a coat that had been expensive, once started toward them at an easy walk. Wyatt moved 3 steps to the right, putting himself between the riders and Amelia, and shifted his rifle from the crook of his arm to a more deliberate position. Don't make any sudden moves, he said quietly, not looking back at her. I'm not, she said. The lead rider pulled up at about 30 yards. He had 2 men flanking him, 1 on each side, and the 4th stayed at the top of the rise. Wyatt noted that arrangement and kept it noted. Afternoon, the lead rider said. He had a voice that had been doing the work of making things sound easy for so long it had become automatic. Nice day for a walk, it is, Wyatt said. The man's eyes went past him to Amelia, stayed there for a moment, then came back to Wyatt with something in them that had shifted. Where are you people headed? North, Wyatt said. Lot of people heading north lately. The man smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. Funny thing. We've been watching this stretch for a few days now. Don't usually see a woman and a baby out this way without a wagon. We're not with a wagon. No, I can see that. The man reached up slowly and pushed his hat back, which was the kind of gesture that was designed to look casual and wasn't. You mind if we have a look at your gear? Just a precaution. There's been some theft in the area. I do mind, Wyatt said. Paused, the 2 flanking riders exchanged a glance. That's not very cooperative, the lead man said. No, Wyatt agreed. Standoff stretched. Wyatt had the specific quiet alertness that came from years of situations that required him to do 2 things at once, hold a conversation at the front, while his eyes and ears tracked everything around it. The 4th rider had moved slightly east on the rise. One of the flanking riders had let his hand drift toward his side without being obvious about it. Amelia, Wyatt said, conversationally, as if he were commenting on the weather. Yes, move to the horse, a beat now, please. He heard her footsteps behind him, measured, not rushing, because she'd heard his tone and understood that rushing was not what the moment called for. The lead rider's eyes followed her movement, and Wyatt used those 2 seconds of divided attention to close 10 yards. That's close enough, the lead man said sharply. My horse is that way, Wyatt said. Your woman's getting on that horse. My horse, Wyatt said. My decision. The dynamic had shifted, he could feel it, the way a weather system felt different before it broke. He had closed the gap, which changed the geometry, and the lead rider was recalculating, and the 2 flanking men were watching their leader for a signal. The 4th man on the rise was the problem Wyatt was thinking about hardest. You're a scout, the lead man said. It wasn't a question. He'd recognized something, the rifle, the way Wyatt stood, something. Cavalry? Former. The man turned this over. That explains you. Doesn't explain the woman. She's not your concern. Maybe not. The man looked at him for a long moment. That's a nice horse it is, Wyatt said. And I've had it for 6 years, and I know exactly what it takes to hold on to it, so I'd encourage you to think carefully about where this goes. Another pause, longer. Behind him, he heard Amelia settle onto the horse. Good. The lead rider looked at Wyatt's rifle, at Wyatt's face, at whatever it was in Wyatt's posture that was telling the truth that his even voice was only partially telling. Men who did what these men did were not, by and large, stupid about risk. They looked for weakness because they needed an advantage, and when they couldn't find the weakness they preferred, they had a choice between manufacturing one and moving on. Nice afternoon, the lead man said eventually. It is, Wyatt said. The rider turned his horse. The 2 flanking men followed. The 4th man on the rise watched for a moment, then turned as well, and all 4 moved south along the ridgeline at the same easy pace they'd used coming in. Wyatt watched until they disappeared behind the rise. Then he kept watching for another full minute. Then he went to the horse. Amelia was holding Ethan, who was awake now and watching everything. Her face was very still. How did you know they would go, she said. I didn't, he said. I knew what made them more likely to. Was closing the distance. If you let men like that keep 30 yards between them and you, they can pretend the cost of the thing is low. He checked the horse's bridle, partly because it needed checking, and partly because his hands needed something to do. When you're 20 yards away, they have to think about it more honestly. She was quiet for a moment. That sounds like something you learned the hard way. Most things worth knowing are. She looked south at the empty ridgeline. They'll come back? Not today, maybe not at all. He looked at her. But we're going to move faster this afternoon. I know, she said. He took the reins and started north. She rode, Ethan in her arms, and neither of them spoke for a while. The afternoon stretched long, and the shadow of the horse grew eastward as the sun moved. And somewhere behind them, 4 riders were deciding whether an armed former cavalry scout and a woman who sat a horse like she wasn't afraid of anything were worth the trouble. Wyatt was betting they'd decide no. He was right, as it turned out. But only because he'd made them think about it. They made Hennessy's ranch on the 4th day, arriving at mid-morning through a gate that needed rehanging, and a yard that smelled of cattle and wood smoke and the particular organized chaos of a working operation in the middle of its season. The place was bigger than Wyatt had made it sound, which Amelia registered without comment. A main house, 2 bunkhouses, a cookhouse, a barn that could hold 30 horses with room to spare, and paddocks extending east in a chain that suggested the cattle operation was substantial. Men moved between the buildings with the purposeful movement of people who had too much to do to slow down for visitors. Hennessy himself came out of the main house before they'd cleared the gate. He was a large man, not fat. Large in the way of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and hadn't stopped, with a red beard going gray at the edges, and the particular squint of a man who spent most of his time outdoors in bright light. He took in Wyatt, the horse, Amelia, and Ethan in one sweeping assessment and settled his gaze on Wyatt. You're late, he said. Had some complications, Wyatt said. Hennessy looked at Amelia with the directness of a man who didn't bother with pretense. Complications? She's traveling north. Got separated from her wagon train. Hennessy's expression didn't change. Exactly, but something in it shifted the particular calculation of a man looking at a situation and figuring out the part he wasn't being told. Traveling north to where? Amelia answered before Wyatt could. I was hoping to ask about work, she said. Her voice was direct and her chin was level, and she looked at Hennessy with exactly the expression of someone who had very little patience for being talked around. I can cook, I can sew, I can manage a household. I understand you have a cook already. I'm asking if there's space for someone who can take whatever's needed. Hennessy studied her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan, who looked back with his usual solemn attention. Baby have a name? Hennessy said. Ethan. Boy? Yes. Hennessy scratched his beard. My cook is 71 years old, and his knees are going. He can't stand at the stove for more than 3 hours at a stretch anymore. He looked at Amelia. You any good? I'm very good, she said without hesitation and without apology. Something moved in Hennessy's expression that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a grin. I'll pay you the going rate for kitchen work, plus room and board. The room's small. You'll share the cookhouse quarters with old Pete, and I want to be clear, he snores. I've managed worse, she said. I imagine you have. He turned to Wyatt. You I expected 2 days ago. I'm here now. You're here now, Hensies agreed with the tone of a man who had already moved on from the grievance. Get your horse settled and come find me. We've got a situation with the east pasture fence that I need someone who can actually track a cattle thief. Wyatt took the horse toward the barn. Amelia stood in the yard for a moment, not lost, just taking stock. The sun was high and the ranch was loud with the sounds of a working day, and Ethan was heavy on her hip after 4 days of constant carrying. She was more tired than she'd let herself acknowledge during, the kind of tired that lived in the specific muscles that didn't get to rest. She'd made it. Not where she'd planned to go, not the future she'd arranged from St. Louis with careful letters and cautious hope, but somewhere with a roof and a wage and a reason to get up in the morning that was more than survival. Wyatt came back from the barn. He'd left the horse and was walking back through the yard, and he stopped. He saw Saarinen still standing where he'd left her. He didn't say anything. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm saying it because it's true. He nodded, and that was all, because he was not a man who filled silence with words just to fill it. He went to find Hennessy. She went to find old Pete in the cookhouse, and Ethan went with her, because Ethan went everywhere with her. And that was, in its way, the only constant she'd had for most of a year. The first week at Hennessy's was an education in how to be useful in a place that wasn't sure yet what to do with you. Pete turned out to be a small, knotted man with a short temper and enormous talent. He'd been cooking for ranch operations for 40 years and had opinions about everything, about the correct way to make biscuits, about which cuts of beef were worth serving to working men versus which ones were an insult to their labor, about the precise moment cornbread was done, which he claimed he could tell by smell alone. He was not initially pleased to share his domain. Don't need help, he told her on the first morning, standing in the doorway of the cookhouse like he intended to block it. Mr. Hennessy said. I know what Hennessy said. Still don't need help. She looked at him calmly. Your knees hurt every morning for the first hour. The way you came down the steps at dawn. You're holding the rail on the right side. The right side is easier if the left knee is worse. She paused. Mine does the same thing in cold weather. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood aside. She learned his kitchen the way she learned everything, by watching first, by not touching things until she understood why they were where they were, by asking questions that were about the work and not about his opinion of her. By the end of the second day, he was letting her handle the noon meal. By the end of the week, he was doing the things he could do and leaving the standing work to her without being asked. You've done this before, he said, one evening, while she was cleaning up. Not on this scale. Smaller kitchens. You cook like someone taught you proper. My mother, she said. Pete made a sound that was approximately acknowledgement and went back to his coffee. The ranch hands were a more complicated negotiation. 40 men in the busy season was not an abstraction. It was 40 individual people with 40 different ideas about women on working ranches, and those ideas ranged from respectful to dismissive to something in between, that expressed itself as too much attention of the wrong kind. She learned the difference quickly. The ones who came in respectful were easy, she fed them well, and they were grateful, and that was the whole of it. The ones who were dismissive were actually easier, because they ignored her and left her alone. It was the middle category she had to manage, the ones who thought that a woman who cooked for them had some additional obligation to be whatever they decided she was. She managed them with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been managing exactly this category of man for most of her adult life. She was direct without being confrontational. She remembered names, all 40 of them, within the first 2 weeks and used them specifically, which had the effect of making men feel seen in a way that tended to moderate their behavior. She was not warm and she was not cold, and she established very early, without drama, that her personal life was not a topic. Wyatt noticed this. He'd been working the east pasture fence situation, which was more complicated than it had initially appeared. 3 sections of fence cut deliberately over a period of weeks. Cattle moved in a pattern that suggested someone who knew the ranch's rotation schedule came in for meals and watched Amelia work the cookhouse with the same attention he'd given her on the trail, and he found himself revising his understanding of her the way you revised a map when you realized the terrain was more complex than the drawing. She wasn't mentioning the ranch, but she was managing her place in it with a precision that most people couldn't have named, but everyone felt. The meals were better. The cookhouse ran more smoothly. Old Pete, who had been declining quietly for a year, was declining more slowly. These were not small things. In a working operation, small things compounded. She's good, Hennessy said one afternoon, appearing beside Wyatt at the fence line, with the supernatural suddenness of large men who moved quietly. She is, Wyatt agreed, not looking up from the section he was examining. Didn't expect that. Neither did she, I think. Hennessy looked at him. What's the real story? Wyatt stood up. I told you. Wagon train separated. I know what you told me. Hennessy squinted. What's the real story? A pause. Wyatt considered what to tell and what to leave alone, which was a calculation he always made and usually got right. Intended backed out, he said. Left her with the wagon master, who left her on the trail. Hennessy was quiet for a moment. With the baby. Yes. Another pause. The man who backed out, Hennessy said, with a particular flatness in his voice. He have a name Whitmore. Has a ranch somewhere west of Benton. Hennessy said nothing, but something moved through his face that Wyatt recognized, not anger exactly. More the cold, specific look of a man filing information for future use. She know anyone out here? Hennessy said. Not before she arrived here. Hennessy looked back at the fence. Then she's got us. He said it like it was a simple factual statement, which Wyatt suspected was exactly how he meant it. Wyatt went back to the fence. Ethan thrived on the ranch in the particular way that babies thrive when they have more than one person paying attention to them. The ranch hands, who had been carefully non-committal about Amelia, had no defenses against a baby with large dark eyes and a serious expression that gave way, without warning, to an enormous grin. By the end of the first week, he was being passed around the lunch table with a casualness that suggested he'd been there for years. Amelia watched this with something she wouldn't quite call relief, because relief implied she'd been holding her breath, which she hadn't. She'd been managing things. But there was a particular unclenching that happened when she saw Ethan held by a ranch hand 3 times his size, both of them regarding each other with equal curiosity, and she understood that some part of her had been worrying, at a level she hadn't fully examined, about what kind of world he was being born into. The world apparently had some good in it. She was in the cookhouse one evening about 3 weeks in, Ethan asleep in the small back room, Pete already gone to bed with his knees when Wyatt came in from the evening patrol. He came in the way he always did, quietly and without announcement, and poured himself coffee from the pot she kept on the stove through the late hours. Anything? She asked, not looking up from the bread she was prepping. Not tonight, he sat. 3rd night in a row, nothing's moved. Either they're done or they're waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know yet. She pressed the dough, turned it, pressed again. Is there someone inside the ranch? Someone giving them the rotation schedule. He looked at her. What makes you think that? You said they knew the rotation. Someone has to tell them. She paused. Unless they watched long enough to work it out themselves. But you said it's been weeks. That's a long time to watch without being seen. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's the same conclusion I came to, he said. Who are the new men this season, not before? He named 4. She listened, and he watched her listening, the particular quality of attention she brought to information she was actually using versus information she was just receiving. One of them, she said, started 2 weeks before the first fence was cut. That timing works, he said. That's not evidence. No, he agreed, but it's a place to start. She shaped the loaves, covered them, set them to the back of the counter for the morning. When she straightened and turned, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not unreadable in the sense of being hidden, more in the sense of being composed of things she didn't have a full vocabulary for yet. What? She said. Nothing. He looked at his coffee. I was thinking you'd have made a good scout. I'd have made a terrible scout. I can't shoot. I'd have taught you. She looked at him. He was looking at the coffee, and she had the distinct sense that he hadn't meant to say that last part, or hadn't meant to say it in quite that way, with the particular present tense ease of someone describing something ordinary that was already decided. Would have, she said, correcting the tense. He looked up. Would have, he agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You've been here 3 weeks, she said. You don't usually stay in one place. Took the job through the fall. The fall's almost over. Then I'll stay through the fall, he said, which was not exactly an answer to what she'd said, and she could tell he knew it. She dried her hands on a cloth and picked up her lamp. Good night, Wyatt. Good night, he said. She went to check on Ethan and to lie in the small room listening to Pete snore through the thin wall and to think about the things she was not yet sure how to think about. While out in the cookhouse, she heard Wyatt's chair push back and his boots cross the floor and the door close quietly behind him as he went back out into the Montana night, back to his patrol, back to the job he'd taken, and the reasons he was starting to have for extending it. Neither of them would have said anything was happening. But both of them were sleeping lighter than they had been. The man Wyatt suspected was named Cal Deers, and he proved it by doing the thing guilty men always eventually did, which was act normal in a way that was slightly too deliberate to actually be normal. Wyatt had been watching him for 4 days without approaching. Cal worked competently, spoke when spoken to, and had the slightly careful posture of someone who knew they were being watched, without knowing by who. On the 5th day, Wyatt moved a section of the rotation schedule without telling anyone but Hennessy, and on the 6th day, the fence in the supposedly clear section was cut. He found Cal at the barn that evening alone, and the conversation was short. He didn't raise his voice. He laid out what he knew and what he'd done to confirm it, and he gave Cal 2 options: leave tonight with whatever he'd earned legitimately and never come back, or wait for Hennessy to handle it, which would involve the sheriff from the nearest town and a set of consequences that were significantly less pleasant. He did not threaten, and he did not bluster. He just made the mathematics of the situation clear. Cal left before midnight. Hennessy found out in the morning and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You should have told me first. You'd have wanted to handle it yourself." "I would have, and it would have gotten louder than it needed to be." Hennessy looked at him with the squint that meant he was deciding how much to agree. "Probably true," he admitted. "But next time, I'll tell you first," Wyatt said. "Good." Hennessy poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot, Amelia's pot, brought over from the cookhouse that morning by one of the hands, as had become the daily routine, and handed one to Wyatt. "She know what you figured out?" "She helped figure it out." Hennessy made the sound that meant acknowledgement. He drank his coffee. "You know there's going to be talk," he said. "There's already talk." "More talk," Hennessy said. "About you and the woman. About her situation. People around here know she came in with you. They're going to make the math they're going to make." Wyatt said nothing. "I'm not telling you how to live," Hennessy said. "I'm telling you what's coming so you're not surprised by it. Appreciate that." "People are going to be unkind to her," Hennessy said more directly, "because she arrived the way she did, because she has a baby without a husband, because women on the frontier don't get the benefit of the doubt the way men do. You know that. I know. It's going to get louder when winter comes and we're all stuck closer together. I know that too." Hennessy drank his coffee and looked out at his ranch, at the yard and the paddocks and the fence line going east. "She's worth more than what happened to her," he said. "That's all I'm saying." "I know," Wyatt said for the 3rd time, and this time it meant something slightly different. And Hennessy heard the difference, because Hennessy was a man who listened carefully, and he said nothing more about it. Outside across the yard, the cookhouse was producing the particular smells of a good breakfast, and Ethan's voice could be heard not crying, just talking, the baby-specific monologue of a child, discovering that sound was something he could produce on demand and somewhere in the business of that ordinary morning. The Montana sky went from gray to pale gold to blue, and the day started up again, the way days on the frontier always did, without waiting for anyone to be ready for it. Talk Hennessy had predicted started the week the first real snow came down. It wasn't dramatic frontier gossip, rarely arrived dramatically. It came the way weather came, first as a change in the air that you couldn't quite name, then as something unmistakable. Amelia noticed it first in the way certain men stopped meeting her eyes at the meal table. Then in the way a conversation between 2 of the older ranch hands stopped when she came into the yard. Then, most clearly, in the way a woman from the neighboring Aldrich spread a sharp-faced woman named Doris Aldrich, who came over to borrow a harness and ended up staying. For coffee, looked at Amelia's left hand while she poured, and then looked at Ethan, and then looked at Amelia's face with the particular expression of a woman who has already made her judgment and is simply confirming the details. Amelia poured the coffee, set the pot down, and said, "Is there something you'd like to ask me directly?" Doris Aldrich looked startled. People often did, when Amelia declined to pretend she hadn't noticed something. "I was just," the woman started. "You were looking at my hand," Amelia said, "and at my son. You're welcome to ask whatever you're wondering about. I'd rather answer a real question than a polite one." Doris Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular candor of someone who had just been outmaneuvered into honesty, she said, "People are saying you came in with Callahan, that there's no husband." "Both of those things are true," Amelia said. "And the baby's father is not present and is not relevant to my work here." She sat down across from the woman and folded her hands on the table. "Wyatt Callahan found me stranded on the trail after the wagon train I was traveling with left me behind. He brought me here. That is the whole of the story between us, and I'd prefer it to be repeated accurately rather than improved. Doris Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then she drank her coffee. You're very direct, she said. I find it saves time, Amelia said. The woman left without the harness. She'd apparently forgotten she'd come for it, and whether she repeated the conversation accurately or not, Amelia couldn't say. But the particular kind of speculation that had been building seemed to lose some of its confidence after that. Not all of it. Never all of it. But enough that the mornings became slightly less weighted. Wyatt heard about the conversation from Hennessy, who heard about it from one of the hands, and he came to the cookhouse that evening and stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she'd learned to read as him, thinking through something he hadn't decided whether to say. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. It might make things harder. Some people don't like direct women, she said. I know that too. She looked at him. Some things are harder either way. I'd rather be uncomfortable for a reason I chose than comfortable for one I didn't. Quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. Were you going to offer to say something on my behalf? She asked. To the people talking? He hesitated. I was thinking about it. Don't, she said, not unkindly. I appreciate the intention. But it would make it worse. A man defending a woman's reputation tends to confirm exactly what people are already deciding. He thought about that. You're right, he said. I usually am, she said. It's one of my less popular qualities. He almost smiled, and then actually smiled, which was rare enough that she noticed it distinctly. Changed his face, completely took 10 years off it, removed the particular careful quality that was usually there, made him look like a man who might, under the right circumstances, laugh at something. She filed that away without examining it too closely. Winter on the ranch was a different animal than the trail or the busy season. Cattle were moved to the winter pasture, and the operation contracted fewer men, closer quarters, longer hours of darkness that pushed everyone inside together, whether they wanted to be or not. The cookhouse became the center of everything. The warmest room on the property, the place where men came to sit longer than meals required, because the alternative was the bunkhouse, which was functional and not much more. Amelia found herself at the center of something she hadn't anticipated, not family exactly, not community in the formal sense, but the particular web of daily life that forms when people are stuck in the same place through a long cold season and have to decide how to manage each other. She learned which men got quiet when things were hard and which ones got loud. She learned who needed extra food without being asked and who would never ask for anything and had to be watched. She learned that Pete's knees were worse in November than October and made adjustments to the kitchen arrangement accordingly, pulling the lower shelves up and moving the heaviest pots to where he didn't have to bend. Pete noticed and said nothing, which was how she knew he was grateful. Ethan learned to pull himself up on the chair legs and then on the table edge, and then at 9 months old to let go and stand for 3 or 4 seconds on his own before sitting down abruptly with a look of profound surprise. This happened for the first time during the afternoon meal, and 6 ranch hands watched it happen and made more noise about it than the baby did. He became, without anyone deciding it, a project. Men who had no particular connection to children found themselves crouching down to offer fingers to grab and watching the progression from standing to stepping with a focus they'd usually reserve for things with more obvious stakes. Wyatt watched this with the particular expression of a man who is observing something he has no category for. One evening he was sitting in the cookhouse later than most people, earlier than Amelia finished cleaning, and Ethan was on the floor between them, working on the problem of a wooden spoon that Amelia had given him to stop him pulling at chair legs. Ethan picked up the spoon, held it, looked at Wyatt with enormous seriousness, and then extended it toward him. Wyatt looked at the offered spoon, then at the baby. He wants me to take it, he said. He wants to give it to you, Amelia said from across the kitchen. He's been doing it, offering things. Wyatt took the spoon with a gravity that matched Ethan's. Ethan made a sound of apparent satisfaction and immediately began looking for something else to offer. He does that with people he trusts, Amelia said. Wyatt looked at the wooden spoon in his hand, then at the baby, who had found a wooden button someone had lost under the stove and was now transferring it toward him with the focused determination of someone completing an important delivery. He accepted the button. That's quite a thing, he said, which was not the most articulate response, but she heard what was underneath it. Yes, she said, it is. The letter arrived in December, carried by a supply rider who also brought flour and lamp oil and a small crate of oranges that Hennessy bought every year at considerable expense because he believed firmly in preventing scurvy during the winter months. It was addressed to Amelia Whitmore, and the handwriting was careful and formal, and she didn't recognize it. She opened it in the back room after the noon meal, with Ethan asleep and the noise of the cookhouse muffled by the door. It was from Thomas Whitmore. Not an apology. She'd read enough careful letters to know the difference between an apology and an explanation, and this was firmly in the second category. He explained that he'd made a decision based on incomplete information. He explained that he'd since learned she had arrived in the territory and was working at a ranch north of the area. He explained that he had a going concern, his word, going concern, and that a woman of her evident competence might still find it a suitable arrangement if she were willing to consider the original proposal under revised terms. He did not ask about Ethan by name. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her lap for a moment. There was a version of herself, the version that had existed 10 months ago in St. Louis, packing everything she owned into a trunk and calculating the mathematics of survival. Who would have considered this letter seriously? Who would have weighed the security of a man's ranch against the uncertainty of her current position and done the arithmetic that women in impossible situations always had to do? She was not that version of herself anymore. She wasn't sure exactly when it had changed. The trail, probably. The creek crossing she hadn't told Wyatt about until they were on the other side. The morning she'd figured out the cookhouse at Hennessy's, and the afternoon she'd named all 40 ranch hands, and the evening she'd sat across from Doris Aldrich and said what was true without softening it. She'd built something these past months. It wasn't large, but it was hers. She went to the small desk in the corner of the back room, a desk Pete used for the supply lists, and wrote a reply that was 6 sentences long. She thanked Thomas Whitmore for writing. She informed him that her situation had changed, and the arrangement was no longer something she was interested in pursuing. She wished him well in finding a suitable match through the agency. She signed it, sealed it, and gave it to the supply rider when he left the next morning. Then she went back to the cookhouse and made biscuits, and did not think about it again, or tried not to, which was not quite the same thing. She didn't tell Wyatt about the letter. She was not sure why, for several days. Then she was sure, which was its own kind of uncomfortable knowledge to have. She hadn't told him because telling him would have required explaining why she'd refused, and explaining why she'd refused would have required being honest about some of the reasons. Some of the reasons had to do with him in ways she wasn't ready to speak out loud. Wyatt found out anyway. Not about the letter specifically. He found out about Whitmore in the particular way that information moved on the frontier, which was that it moved through people who knew people, and one of Hennessy's contacts mentioned that Whitmore had sent correspondence north. And Hennessy mentioned it to Wyatt with the directness of a man who believed relevant information should be shared. Wyatt's first reaction was an immediate, specific anger that surprised him with its force. His second reaction was to examine the first one, which he did with the methodical honesty he applied to things. And what he found was not comfortable, but was at least clear. He waited until an evening when Pete had gone to bed early and Ethan was asleep and Amelia was at the stove and they were the only 2 people in the cookhouse. Came in from the evening check, poured coffee, sat down, and said, "Hennessy mentioned Whitmore wrote to you." She didn't turn from the stove. He did. You didn't say anything. No, can I ask why? She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned. She leaned against the stove with her arms crossed. Not defensively, more like she was deciding how to hold herself while she said something that required care. Because it wasn't relevant, she said. I decided in about 3 minutes that I wasn't going to consider it, and I wrote back and said so. He absorbed this. Just like that. Just like that. You could have had a ranch, he said. Security. I have work, she said. I have Ethan. I have a roof. She looked at him steadily. What I would have had with Whitmore is a man who already decided I wasn't worth the inconvenience once. I'd rather build something that's actually mine than live in something someone else controls. He was quiet for a moment. Then that's not the only reason. It was a risk. Saying that, she heard that he knew it was a risk, and she looked at him for a long time. No, she said finally, it's not the only reason. Neither of them said what the other reasons were. But the silence was different after that, had a different texture, a different weight. And Wyatt sat with his coffee, and Amelia went back to the stove, and the cookhouse was warm, and outside the Montana winter pressed in from every direction, and neither of them moved to close the distance that the conversation had just made smaller. It was the slowest thing either of them had done. But on the frontier, the slow things were usually the real ones. January brought a blizzard that lasted 4 days and kept everyone inside with the specific intimacy of people who have no choice about proximity. The ranch hands played cards and argued and repaired tack and drove each other slowly toward the edge of tolerance, in the way of people who were fundamentally decent but were not designed for this much closeness. Amelia cooked 3 meals a day and kept the coffee hot between them and learned more about 30 men than she'd expected to learn about people she hadn't chosen to know. Wyatt spent the blizzard doing the things she had noticed he did when he couldn't be outside. He occupied himself completely, without complaint, with whatever needed doing in whatever room he was in. He repaired the broken chair that had been waiting for 3 weeks. He resoled a boot for one of the hands who didn't know how. He sharpened every knife in the cookhouse, with a patience she found almost meditative to watch, doing each one slowly and correctly. On the second night of the storm, with the wind loud against the walls and most of the men in the bunkhouse, he sat at the cookhouse table, and she sat across from him with the mending she'd been working through. And Ethan slept in the back room, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about anything in particular. That was the thing she remembered afterward, not the subjects, but the quality of it, the back and forth of 2 people who were interested in how the other one thought. He told her about the cavalry, about the Montana Territory before the ranches, about the things he'd seen that he wished he hadn't, and the things he'd seen that still seemed worth the trouble of having seen. She told him about St. Louis, about her mother's kitchen, about the particular education of growing up without enough money, which teaches you things that having enough money prevents you from learning. "You're not angry," he said at one point. She looked up from the mending. "About what? All of it. The wagon train Whitmore. All of it." He wasn't accusing her of anything. He seemed genuinely puzzled, the way a person was puzzled by something that didn't fit their model of how things worked. "I'd be angry." "I am angry," she said. "I'm just not leading with it." She bit the thread, turned the mended piece over. Anger is useful when it tells you something you need to know. It's not useful when it just sits there making everything harder. "That's a very controlled way to feel things," he said. "Maybe," she said. "My mother would have said it differently. She'd have said there's no luxury in falling apart when someone needs you to hold together." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been holding together for a long time." Kept her eyes on the mending. "Since before Ethan," she said. "Probably since I was about 12. That's a long time. People manage longer." She set the mending down and looked at him. "You've been running from something since before you got to the cavalry. I can see it in how you carry yourself. You're not the kind of man who drifts unless something pushed you to it first." He looked at her with the expression that meant she'd hit something true, and he was deciding how to respond to it. "My brother," he said finally. She waited. "He died. Winter of '63, not in the war, just sick. Pneumonia. I was supposed to come back home that spring, and I didn't, because I kept signing on for another season. And then another, and by the time I actually went back, he stopped. My mother said she understood. She probably did. But that's one of those things you carry because understanding isn't the same as it being all right." She said nothing for a moment. "Then that's why you stopped." "When I saw you," he said. "Yes, partly. You weren't going to be the person who kept going." "I wasn't going to be that person again," he said, and the word "again" contained the whole story he'd just told in a single syllable. The wind was very loud outside, and the fire was low, and Amelia looked at Wyatt Callahan sitting across from her at the cookhouse table with his hands around a coffee cup, and his face doing something careful and honest at the same time, and she thought about what it meant to build a thing slowly, the way you built anything worth having. Not because the moment was right, but because the foundation was. "You should sleep," she said. "You'll be doing fence checks at dawn if the wind dies." "I know," he said. He didn't move for a moment. Then he stood, picked up his cup, and put it by the wash basin. At the door he paused. "Amelia," she looked up. "For what it's worth," he said. "I'm glad you refused the letter." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He went out into the storm. February came with a thaw that didn't last, and a problem that did. 2 men arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning with papers from a land office, and the particular look of people who were confident their papers meant more than other people's presence. They were from a company called Western Territorial Holdings, a name that Amelia had never heard, and Hennessy recognized with a jaw tightening that she could see from across the yard. She was at the cookhouse window. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the shape of it, the 2 men presenting documents, Hennessy reading them with a stillness that meant he was controlling his response. Wyatt standing slightly to the side with his arms crossed, and the position of his feet that she'd learned meant he was calculating something. She put Ethan in the back room and went out. She wasn't invited. Nobody asked her to come. But she'd spent enough time in this yard that nobody questioned it either, and she came to stand near enough to hear. The taller of the two men was explaining something about survey records and a disputed boundary on the eastern section. The language was formal and specific, and she understood most of it, because her father had dealt with land disputes before his accident, and she'd grown up listening to those conversations. Core of it was simple. Western Territorial Holdings claimed that 200 acres of Hennessy's east pasture, the same east pasture where the fence had been cut in the fall, had been improperly surveyed when Hennessy filed his original claim, and they had documentation supporting a counterclaim. This documentation, Hennessy said, holding the papers, is dated 3 weeks ago. The survey discrepancy was identified 3 weeks ago, the taller man said smoothly. Hennessy looked at the papers. And who filed the original counterclaim? Western Territorial Holdings. And who does Western Territorial Holdings represent? A brief pause. That information is confidential at this stage of the process. Amelia said, who approved the survey? All 4 men looked at her. The taller man blinked. I beg your pardon. The survey that identified the discrepancy, she said. Who approved it? There has to be a certifying name on the survey itself. She looked at Hennessy. May I? Hennessy handed her the papers. She read through them with the careful speed of someone who knew what they were looking for and where to find it. The survey was signed by a certifying official named R. W. Hadley out of the Territorial Land Office in Helena. The date was December 14th. The filing had been processed December 22nd. This survey was certified and filed in the same month, she said. Very fast. She looked at the taller man. A standard survey certification process takes 6 to 8 weeks for a parcel this size. There's a processing backlog at the Territorial Office. Anyone who has dealt with Helena recently knows this. How was this processed in 8 days? The taller man opened his mouth, closed it. I'm asking because if there was a procedural irregularity in the filing, she said that's something the land office would need to know about before this dispute can proceed. Counterclaim filed on the basis of an improperly certified survey isn't a valid counterclaim. She looked at the papers again. I'd also like to know who R.W. Hadley is, because I've dealt with the Helena office, and I don't recognize that name. 2 men exchanged a look. The taller one's confidence had taken on a slightly different quality, not gone, but recalibrated. These are valid legal documents, he said. They may be, she said, or there may be questions about how they were processed. You won't know until you check, and neither will we. She handed the papers back to Hennessy. I'd suggest you consult with a lawyer in Helena before this goes any further. Send someone to verify R.W. Hadley's credentials and the processing timeline. The 2 men left 20 minutes later with the papers and the particular posture of people who had come expecting a simple transaction and gotten something more complicated. Hennessy looked at her. Wyatt looked at her. She looked back at both of them. My father dealt with a land dispute when I was 14, she said. Company tried the same kind of thing in Ohio. Similar document, similar approach, she paused. The survey certifier turned out to be the company's own employee working a second job at the land office. They were filing fraudulent counterclaims across 3 counties. And R.W. Hadley? Wyatt said, I don't know, she said. The processing time is wrong. Someone should find out. Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. I'll send a man to Helena tomorrow, he said. I'll also send a letter to my lawyer. He rubbed the back of his neck. How do you know all this? I read the papers, she said. And I listen to things I'm not always supposed to be listening to. She went back to the cookhouse. Wyatt came in about an hour later and stood in the doorway in the way he did when something was working itself out in his head. Western Territorial Holdings, he said. Yes, the cattle thief. Cal Deers. She looked at him. I was thinking the same thing. Someone's been looking at this land for a while. The fence cuts were reconnaissance, she said, figuring out the operation. Then the formal counterclaim. They're trying to take the east pasture. They're trying to establish a foothold, she said. The east pasture is 200 acres. If they get it through a fraudulent claim, they can use it to file additional surveys on adjacent land. It's a method. He looked at her with the expression that she recognized now, the one that meant she'd gotten ahead of him, and he was catching up. How far ahead of this are you? Not far enough, she said honestly. I know the shape of it. I don't know who's behind the company. That's the piece that matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then Whitmore. She hadn't gotten there yet. She thought about it. He has ranch land west of here. He'd want to expand east. She considered it. Possible, but we'd need proof. The man I sent away, Wyatt said. Cal Deers. If someone hired him, he could tell us who. He could, Wyatt said. If we could find him. Is that something you can do? He looked at her. Is that something you're asking me to do? She held his gaze. I'm asking if it's possible. It's possible. Take some time. She nodded, turned back to the stove. Then, without turning around, be careful. He was quiet for a moment. Always am. No, you're not, she said, but I appreciate the sentiment. She heard something that was almost a laugh, not quite. Just the sound of a man deciding against laughing, but not quite succeeding. And then the door, and then his footsteps across the yard, and then the particular quiet of the cookhouse that she'd grown used to, and fond of in ways she hadn't expected when she'd walked into it for the first time 4 months ago. He was gone 11 days. She hadn't asked where he was going specifically because she understood that specifics in this kind of thing were information that could be compelled out of someone, and the less she knew, the better. Hennessy knew in a general way, and that was enough. The 11 days were normal days' meals and mending, and Ethan, who was now pulling himself to standing on everything and conducting exploratory missions across the cookhouse floor with the focused energy of someone who had recently discovered that the world was larger than previously suspected. She did not worry about Wyatt in a way she showed to anyone. She worried about him in the private way, in the in-between moments, and she managed it the way she managed most things, by noting it and moving on. He came back on a Thursday, the same day of the week. The 2 men from Western Territorial Holdings had arrived, which struck her as a coincidence the frontier would have considered meaninglessly symbolic. He looked tired, and he needed a shave, and he came directly to the cookhouse, which suggested he was hungry, and she fed him without ceremony and waited while he ate. Then he told her what he'd found. Chaldeers had not been difficult to locate men. Like Chaldeers tended to go to ground in predictable places, and Wyatt had found him in a small settlement 2 days east, doing exactly what guilty men did, which was nothing, very quietly. Conversation had been frank. Cal had provided a name. Not Whitmore. The name was Garrison Pell. Amelia didn't know it. Wyatt did from the cavalry years, from a land deal in Wyoming that had gone wrong in ways that cost 3 ranchers everything they had. Pell was not a man who operated directly. He used companies and employees and layers of distance between himself and what happened at the end of the chain. Western Territorial Holdings was his. The surveyor R. W. Hadley was exactly as she'd suspected, an employee, and Whitmore not the originator of the scheme, but a partner. He'd approached Pell after his arrangement with Amelia fell through, apparently redirecting his interest from acquiring a wife to acquiring the land that surrounded the ranch where she'd ended up, which was a particular kind of meanness that she found she was not surprised by. He knows I'm here, she said. It was not a question. He knows you're here, Wyatt said. She absorbed that. Ethan was on the floor, engaged with a wooden block, and she watched him for a moment. What does he want? The land, Wyatt said. You're incidental. I'm not sure that's entirely true, she said. A man doesn't redirect a land scheme toward the specific ranch where his rejected arrangement ended up without at least part of it being about the rejection. Wyatt looked at her. Then he looked at his coffee. Probably not. He's embarrassed, she said. Or something like it. Men like Whitmore don't handle being told no by someone they've already dismissed. She paused. That makes him more dangerous than someone who's purely after the land. Rational business decisions are predictable. Wounded pride isn't. That's true, Wyatt said. So what do we do? He put his coffee down. The hell in a lawyer, he said. Hennessy's already got someone there. Processing irregularities give us grounds to challenge the survey. If Hadley's credentials don't hold up, the counterclaim collapses, she said. But Pell files another one through a different company. What they did in Ohio. I know, he said. So we need to make it expensive enough that he decides the land isn't worth the fight. He paused. And we need to make sure Whitmore understands that his connection to Pell is documented. Leverage, she said. Information, he said. Which is the same thing, used right. She looked at him across the table, at the tiredness in his face and the particular steadiness underneath it, the quality she'd first noticed when he walked out to face 4 riders in an open field and hadn't flinched. He was a man who had decided something, a long time ago, about how he was going to be in the world, and who kept being that way even when it was inconvenient. She understood that quality from the inside. You went 11 days, she said. You could have sent a letter after you found Cal. Done the rest from here. He looked at her. I could have. Why didn't you? A pause. I wanted to know the full picture before I came back, he said. I didn't want to come back with half of it. It was true as far as it went. She could see it was also not the complete answer, and she could see that he knew she could see that. And they sat in that small, honest space for a moment without moving. You should sleep, she said, because she'd said it before, and it was still true. And it was also the kindest way she had of saying the other things she wasn't ready to say yet. In a while, he said, "Ethan will want to show you things," she said. "He's gotten very committed to giving people objects he finds." "I know," Wyatt said. "He gave me a button at Christmas." "He gave you the button in November." "I still have it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. She thought about the button, a small wooden button from Pete's spare tin, and what it meant that he'd kept it. And she thought about all the small true things that accumulated between people over the months without anyone naming them. And she thought about the difference between the woman who had sat on a broken trunk in the Montana prairie, trying to decide if a stranger's hand was worth taking, and the woman she was right now, in this cookhouse, with this man at her table. The distance between those two women was not very far, and the distance between where she sat and where he sat was smaller than it had been. Ethan picked up the wooden block, turned it over twice with the focused attention of a scientist, and then extended it toward Wyatt. Wyatt reached across the table and took it. "Thank you," he told Ethan with the gravity the gift deserved. Ethan made a sound of evident satisfaction. Outside, the Montana winter went about its business, cold and enormous and indifferent, the way it always was. And inside the cookhouse, something that had been building for 6 months settled another inch toward the ground, quiet and unhurried and entirely real. The lawyer's name was Edmund Ferris, and he arrived from Helena on a gray March morning with a leather satchel that looked older than he was, and a manner that suggested he had seen a great deal of frontier foolishness and had developed a precise tolerance for exactly how much of it he was willing to engage with. He was Hennessy's lawyer, had been for 11 years, and he read through everything Amelia had compiled her notes on the processing timeline, the questions about R.W. Hadley, the pattern she'd identified across the 3 fence-cutting incidents, and the timing of the survey filing with the particular attention of a man who was being paid to find the problems in an argument, but was finding instead that the argument was sound. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at her over his reading glasses. "You prepared this?" "I organized it," she said. "The information came from several sources." "Who taught you to read a land filing?" "My father dealt with a similar situation in Ohio." 14. Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Hennessy. Then he looked back at her. "Processing irregularity is the strongest point," he said. W. Hadley was employed by a survey company that has since been established to have ties to Western Territorial Holdings. Conflict of interest that invalidates the certification. He tapped the papers. "This doesn't prove fraud by itself, but it gives us grounds to demand a full resurvey under independent certification, and while that process is ongoing, the counterclaim is suspended." "How long does the resurvey take?" Wyatt said. 6 months minimum, possibly 8. "And in that time?" Hennessy said. "In that time, Western Territorial Holdings can't advance the claim, can't file adjacent surveys based on it, can't do anything with it." Ferris picked up the papers and squared them. "But here's the difficulty. They'll know the claim is suspended almost immediately after we file the challenge. And men like Garrison Pell don't sit and wait for legal processes to play out." "What do?" Amelia said. "They apply pressure elsewhere." He looked at her directly. "You understand that your presence here is not incidental to this situation." "I know. Pell is Whitmore's partner. Whitmore has a specific interest in this ranch that goes beyond the land value. That makes the situation less predictable than a purely financial dispute." "I told Hennessy I could leave," she said. "If my being here is making things harder." "Don't be ridiculous," Hennessy said from across the table. "I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being practical. If Whitmore's wounded pride is complicating a land dispute that wouldn't otherwise involve." "You're not leaving," Wyatt said. It was the flattest, most unambiguous thing he'd said in months, and it landed in the room with a weight that made Ferris look at him, and then at Amelia, and then back at his papers with the expression of a man who had just received information he hadn't been looking for but would now have to incorporate into his understanding of the situation. Amelia looked at Wyatt. He was looking at the table. His jaw was set in the particular way it was when he'd said the thing he meant to say and wasn't going to revisit it. "Fine," she said after a moment. Not to him, to herself. Ferris filed the challenge to the survey certification in Helena 2 days later. He also, on Amelia's suggestion, sent a separate letter to the Territorial Land Office requesting a full audit of R.W. Hadley's certifications over the past 18 months, not just the Hennessy survey, but everything. If Hadley had been filing fraudulent certifications for Western Territorial Holdings, there would be a pattern, And patterns were the kind of thing that turned a property dispute into a criminal investigation. That last part had been her idea, and Ferris had looked at her when she suggested it and said, "That escalates this considerably." "Yes," she said. "Pell will respond to escalation." "I know," she said. "But a man who knows he's being investigated for fraud moves differently than a man who thinks he's managing a property dispute. He makes mistakes." Ferris had considered this for a long moment. Then he'd written the letter. Pell's response arrived, not in the form of lawyers or documents, but in the form of a man named Rourke, who showed up at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon and asked to speak with Hennessy. Amelia was in the yard when he arrived, helping one of the hands carry a load of supply crates from the wagon that had come in that morning. She saw the man come through the gate on a very good horse, too good for a working cowhand, kind of horse that was maintained for appearance, and she registered something in the way he looked around the yard that had nothing to do with being lost. He was assessing the place, counting buildings, noting where men were working, looking for the main house. She set her end of the crate down. "Can I help you?" He looked at her with the quick recalibration of someone who'd expected to deal with men and was adjusting. "Looking for the owner. Mr. Hennessy is in the north pasture. He'll be back for the evening meal." She looked at him steadily. "Is there something I can help you with in the meantime?" "I don't think so," he said pleasantly. "You're welcome to wait," she said. "Cookhouse is warm." He smiled in the way of a man who was used to managing women by being agreeable to their faces. "That's kind of you." She brought him to the cookhouse and put coffee in front of him and went about her work. She was in the room, and he was in the room, and she could hear everything he said and observe everything he did. He seemed to find this arrangement acceptable, which told her he hadn't identified her as anything other than the cook. He kept it that way. He talked while he waited, the particular easy conversation of a man who talked to everyone the way a fisherman cast a wide net. He asked about the operation, about how long Hennessy had been running cattle in this section, about whether the winter had been hard. She answered in the general way of someone whose job it was to be pleasant and who wasn't particularly interested in the conversation. He asked, almost as an aside, "That east pasture section, they run cattle out there year-round?" "I wouldn't know about the pasture rotations," she said. "That's the foreman's territory, of course." He drank his coffee. "Nice operation, though. Somebody knows what they're doing." "Mr. Hennessy has been at this a long time," she said. Wyatt came in from the side door about 20 minutes later, and she saw the moment the two men looked at each other and recognized something, not familiarity, but category. Two people who had spent time in the kind of work where you learn to read people quickly. Wyatt looked at her. She looked back, and in the fraction of that look communicated what she'd observed, which was the question about the east pasture and the too good horse, and the way the man had assessed the yard. Wyatt poured himself coffee and sat at the far end of the table and didn't say much. He didn't have to. His presence changed the room. The man named Rourke finished his coffee and said he'd come back another time for Hennessy, and left, and they watched him go through the cookhouse window. "Pell's man," Wyatt said. "I think so." She picked up the man's coffee cup. "He asked about the east pasture." "That's what I thought." Wyatt turned from the window. He was taking stock, seeing what the operation looks like, how many men, what the lay of the land is. He'll report back that Hennessy has a full crew, a ranch hand who was cavalry, and a woman who asks too many questions. "Figure out who you were?" "No," she said. "He thought I was the cook." "You are the cook." "I am," she said. And the cook heard everything he said. She told Wyatt about the east pasture question, the horse, the way he'd looked around the yard on arrival. Wyatt listened with the stillness that meant he was adding it to a picture he was building. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. "With an offer, probably. That's how Pell operates: pressure first, then a reasonable-sounding offer to make the pressure stop. Hennessy buys them out of the counterclaim or sells them the east pasture at a low price, and everyone acts like it was a business transaction. And if Hennessy won't sell, then the pressure gets less subtle." Wyatt set his cup down. "We need to know the timeline." "How long before the land office audit results come back?" Ferris said 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a long time if they decide to move. She looked at him. "What would you do if you were Pell?" "Thought about it. I'd make the situation uncomfortable enough that Hennessy wanted it over before the audit finished. Not violence, not directly. Something that looks like bad luck. A fire in the wrong place, some cattle getting spooked onto a neighbor's land, an accident." He paused. "Something that costs money and time without looking deliberate." She'd thought of the same things. "We need to be watching." "We've been watching." "Watching harder," she said. He nodded. He looked tired again, the same tiredness he'd had when he came back from finding Chaldeers, the kind that came from thinking about something that didn't have clean edges. She understood it. She'd been carrying a version of the same weight since Ferris had filed the challenge. Go eat something real, she said. I made actual food today, not just the afternoon bread. He looked at her with a slight shift of expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. You feed everyone when you're worried, he said. I've noticed. Paused in the middle of what she was doing. That's a very observant thing to say. You made 4 extra loaves last week when the Ferris letter went out. Pete likes extra bread. Pete said he didn't ask for it. Turned back to the stove. Sit down and eat, she said, which was not an admission and not a denial, and he clearly knew it, because he sat down and ate and said nothing more about it. The fire happened 9 days later. Not the barn, they'd all been watching the barn, the most obvious target, and whoever had said it had known that. It was the haystack on the southeast corner of the property, the farthest point from where any of the hands slept, set sometime in the pre-dawn hours when the cold made everyone sleep heavier than they should. It was Amelia who woke to it. She'd always slept lightly had since Ethan was born, the constant monitoring of a mother, and something pulled her out of sleep at what she estimated was 2 or 3 in the morning. Some change in the smell of the air, or the quality of the light coming through the small window. She couldn't have said which. She sat up, looked at the window, and saw the orange. She had Ethan bundled and was out the door in less time than she would have thought possible, and she hit the bell outside the cookhouse, the large iron bell that meant emergency, with the flat of her hand twice before she'd fully decided to do it. Men came out of the bunkhouse confused and fast, the way men did when they were woken by a bell that meant something was wrong, and she was already pointing southeast before any of them had oriented. They saved the barn. That was the important thing. The haystack was gone 2 tons of winter feed. Not a small loss, but the wind that night was, through no particular luck, coming from the north, and it pushed the fire southeast rather than northwest toward the buildings. They managed it through the rest of the night and into the gray morning with the organized exhaustion of people who had done a bad thing well. Hennessy stood in the yard at dawn and looked at what was left of the haystack. His face was doing something controlled and cold that she'd learned was more dangerous than anger. This was said, he said, not a question. Yes, Wyatt said. He'd been examining the origin point while the others managed the fire, and he came back with soot on his hands and his verdict already reached. Deliberate. Started at the base on the south side, away from the wind. Hell, Hennessy said. Can't prove it, Wyatt said. I know I can't prove it. Hennessy turned. How much feed did we lose? About 2 tons, one of the hands said. We've enough to get through to spring pasture? Maybe, if the weather holds. Hennessy was quiet for a moment. Then get Ferris on the telegraph today. I want him to add the fire to the record, any insurance claim, any document we file, it goes in. He looked at Wyatt. And I want Rourke found, the man who came here last week. I want to know where he went after he left here and who he talked to. I'll find him, Wyatt said. Amelia, standing at the edge of the yard with Ethan on her hip, he'd slept through the whole thing in the sling she'd made, to keep her hands free, said, There's something else. Both men looked at her. The fire was a message, she said. Pell wants Hennessy to know it was deliberate without being able to prove it. He's showing what he can do, not doing the worst of it yet. She looked at Hennessy, which means he expects you to respond. An offer is coming. He'll send someone not Rourke, someone more official, and they'll present a number for the east pasture that's low but not insultingly low. And they'll make clear without saying it that the alternative to accepting the offer is more of this. And your advice, Hennessy said. Don't accept, she said. And let me be in the room when they come. Hennessy looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because the offer will be designed to sound reasonable. And I've seen this kind of thing designed. I'll know where the problems are. She paused. And because whoever they send will underestimate me. And that's useful. Hennessy looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Amelia. She's right, he said. Hennessy made the sound that meant he'd already decided and was simply noting the confirmation. Fine, he said. You're in the room. The offer came the following Tuesday in the form of a man named Gerald Stroud, who was a lawyer of some kind and wore his credentials the way certain men wore expensive coats conspicuously. He arrived with a document already prepared and a manner that suggested the meeting's conclusion was a formality, and they all knew it. He did not look at Amelia when she brought coffee. He said thank you to the air in her general direction, which was so precisely what she'd predicted that she had to work to keep her expression flat. She sat at the end of the table. Stroud looked at her and then at Hennessy with a polite question in his expression. My bookkeeper, Hennessy said, which was not true but was also not entirely untrue, given what she'd been doing for the past month. Stroud nodded and returned to his document. The offer was $400 for the 200-acre East Pasture section. It was presented as fair market value, with supporting documentation from a property assessor that Amelia recognized as the same company that had ties to Western Territorial Holdings. She said nothing. She made a small note. Stroud walked through the offer with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew how to make numbers sound final. He noted that the land dispute created uncertainty that affected the value of the whole operation. He noted that this offer resolved the dispute cleanly and quickly. He did not mention the fire. He presented the document and slid it across to Hennessy. Hennessy picked it up and read it slowly. Amelia said, "The property assessment is from Consolidated Territory Assessors. Can you tell me who their certifying authority is?" Stroud looked at her, actually, for the first time since she'd sat down. "I beg your pardon." "The property assessment supporting the offer," she said. "It's from Consolidated Territory Assessors. That company has been identified in our legal correspondence as having a business relationship with Western Territorial Holdings, which is the company making this offer." She paused. Using a company affiliated with the buyer to establish the value of the thing being bought is a conflict of interest. It would likely be raised as a problem if Hennessy accepted this offer and the transaction was later reviewed. Pause. "It's a standard industry assessment," Stroud said. "Then an independent assessment would produce the same number," she said pleasantly. "We'd be happy to commission one. It would take about 3 weeks. The offer has a 10-day window. Then perhaps Western Territorial Holdings would be willing to extend it while an independent assessment is conducted. If the number is the same, there's no loss to them." She looked at him with the exact expression of a woman being cooperative. "Unless the numbers wouldn't be the same." Stroud looked at Hennessy. Hennessy was looking at the document with the stillness he'd had since the fire, the controlled cold that was more unsettling than anger. "We'd also want to know," Amelia continued, "how this offer affects the pending challenge to the original survey certification. Because if the survey certification is found to be fraudulent, which is what the Land Office audit is currently investigating, then Western Territorial Holdings' claim on this land was never valid, which means this offer is for land they never had a legitimate claim to, which means the legal standing of the transaction is." "The audit is speculative," Stroud said. "The audit was requested based on documented evidence of a conflict of interest," she said, "which is slightly different from speculative." She looked at him. "I don't mean to be adversarial, Mr. Stroud. I'm asking questions that any competent review of this transaction would ask. The offer is solid. It'll hold up to the questions." Stroud straightened his papers. He was doing the recalculation she'd watched Pell's man do when he came to look at the ranch, adjusting to a room that wasn't what he'd expected. "I'll convey your questions to my clients," he said with the careful neutrality of a man retreating in an orderly fashion. "Please do," she said, "and please let them know we'd welcome a response in writing." Stroud left without a signed document. Hennessy sat in the room for a moment after he was gone, and then said, without looking up from the table, $400. The flatness of his voice contained the entire insult. 200 acres. $400. "The independent assessment would probably put it at $1,200 to $1,500, she said. "At current cattle prices and water access. I know what it's worth." He looked up. "You were right about how it would go. I've seen it before." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife would have liked you," he said. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Thank you." "She died 3 years ago," he said. "She was the one who read the contracts. I always said I didn't need anyone to read them for me." He picked up the document Stroud had left. "She was right about that, as she was about most things." He set it down. "You're good at this. At reading documents. At seeing what people are actually doing," he said. "They're after, how they're going about it." He looked at her. "Whitmore's a fool. Sending that letter." She hadn't expected him to bring up the letter, and she felt the small surprise of it. "Thought my situation had changed enough that I might reconsider." "He was hoping you were desperate enough," Hennessy said. "There's a difference." He stood up, which meant the conversation was over, in the way his conversations always ended completely and without ambiguity. "Write up a summary of today for Ferris. Everything you noticed about the assessment conflict. Everything the man said. I'll have it done by tomorrow." He left. She sat alone in the room for a moment, with the rejected document on the table, and the smell of the coffee, and the distant sounds of the ranch going about its business. Through the window, she could see the southeastern corner of the property, where the haystack had been. The burn mark was still there on the frozen ground, a dark shape that the snow hadn't covered yet. She thought about the woman Hennessy had described, the wife, who read the contracts, who was right about most things. The woman who had done exactly what Amelia was doing, in this same room, for 11 years, until she wasn't there anymore. She thought about all the women like that, the ones who did the reading and the noticing and the work of keeping things together, while the men with their names on the documents got the credit for the stability, not with resentment. It was just a fact that the frontier ran on invisible labor, and most of the invisible labor was women's. Picked up the document and folded it neatly and put it in the file she'd made for Ferris. Then she went back to the cookhouse. Wyatt found Rourke in a boarding house in a small town called Millhaven, 2 days' ride east, which was further than he'd expected and closer than it should have been for a man who'd completed a job and had no more reason to linger. The fact that Rourke was still in the territory told him something. He didn't confront the man directly. He'd learned the limits of that approach when the confrontation produced the answer you expected, but not the information you needed. Instead, he spent a day in Millhaven watching, the way he'd learned to watch on the trail and in the cavalry, the particular patience of a man who understood that people doing things they didn't want seen would eventually do them in front of you if you waited long enough. Rourke met with 2 men on the second evening, in a saloon that had a back room that thought it was private and wasn't. The 2 men were not from Western Territorial Holdings. They were working men, physical, quiet, the kind of men who were hired for the kind of jobs that didn't go in a contract. Wyatt left Millhaven before Rourke saw him. He rode hard and arrived back at Hennessy's on a night that was barely above freezing, and he went to the cookhouse because the light was on, and Amelia was at the table with Ferris's summary half-written in front of her, and Ethan asleep in the back room. He told her what he'd seen. She set down her pen. He's hired men. 2 of them. Not local. I don't know yet. But it's not another fire. You don't bring 2 outside men for a fire. She was quiet for a moment. The audit results. What about them? Ferris said 6 weeks. That's in 10 days. She looked at him. If Pell knows the audit is close, and he probably does, if he has anyone connected to the land office, he knows the window for the counterclaim is closing. After the audit, if Hadley's certifications are found to be fraudulent, the whole thing collapses. Can't file another claim without it being immediately scrutinized. She paused. He's running out of time to make this uncomfortable enough that Hennessy settles, which means the next move comes soon. In the next 10 days, she said, before the results. He sat down across from her. He looked tired again properly. Tired. Not the thinking tired she'd seen through the winter, but physically wrung out from the riding. She got up and heated what was left in the pot without being asked, and he accepted the coffee without comment, and the ease of it was so complete by now that neither of them noticed it. If it's not another fire, she said, sitting back down, what is it? Something that can't be connected back to Pell, he said. An accident. Or something that creates enough chaos that settling starts to look like sense. He drank the coffee. Or something personal. She heard what he meant by personal. Me or Ethan. She said nothing for a moment. The word sat in the room with its full weight. They wouldn't touch a child, she said, not certain. Asking. I don't know what Pell would authorize, Wyatt said honestly. I don't think he's that kind of man. But the men he uses sometimes have their own judgment about what's necessary. She looked at her hands on the table. She was not going to be afraid in a way she showed him. She was going to be practical. What do we do? I'm going to talk to Hennessy tonight. We need to add men to the night watch and change the patterns so they're not predictable. And he paused. I'd like Ethan to sleep closer to the main house, not in the cookhouse. She looked at him. Where Hennessy has the room off the back, he said. It's inside the main structure, away from every exterior wall. He'd agree to that? He already offered, Wyatt said. 3 days ago, he's been thinking about this too. She considered it. She didn't like the feeling of it. The admission that her son needed to be moved for his safety, the acknowledgement that the threat was real enough to require that kind of response. She'd known it was real. She'd been acting on that knowledge for weeks. But moving Ethan to the main house made it specific in a way that was harder to carry. All right, she said, you'd stay in the cookhouse. I'll stay in the cookhouse, she said. I'm not moving into the main house. I have work there and it's close enough. She looked at him. But I want to be the one who brings him back and forth. Every morning and every evening. I do it myself. That's reasonable, he said. She nodded. Then she picked up her pen and looked at the summary she'd been writing for Ferris. And she stared at it for a moment without reading it, because her mind was doing what it did when she was managing something that had emotional weight, running through the practical steps very deliberately, so the emotional weight didn't have room to sit down. "He's going to be fine," Wyatt said. She looked up. He was looking at her directly, not performing reassurance, just saying a thing he believed. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm going to make it true." She held his gaze for a moment. She wanted to say something about the certainty of that, about how it wasn't something he could promise, how the frontier didn't care about what men intended. She'd said things like that before, in her head, in the months of building careful self-sufficiency. She knew how to name all the ways that certainty was unreliable. She didn't say any of it. "Okay," she said instead. "Just that." He nodded, finished his coffee, went to find Hennessy. She sat alone and finished the summary for Ferris, writing it out in the careful, detailed way she'd learned to write things that needed to be on the record. And when she was done, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the cookhouse and listened to the ranch around her, the sounds of the night watch changing, the distant movement of horses, the ordinary machinery of a place that had become, without her fully deciding it, home. The attempt came 6 days before the audit results. It wasn't what any of them had predicted, which she supposed was the point. It came in the form of a woman. She arrived at midday, which was when the cookhouse was at its busiest, and Amelia was moving between the stove and the tables, and the yard with the particular controlled speed of the noon meal rush. She was young, early 20s, pretty in a tired way, wearing clothes that were good quality and badly cared for. She asked for Amelia Whitmore by name, which stopped 3 men mid-meal and stopped Amelia mid-step. She brought the woman to the back room. The woman's name, she said, was Clara, and she had come from Whitmore's ranch west of Benton, and she had come because she thought Amelia should know some things. Amelia sat across from her and looked at her and said, "What things?" Clara told her that she'd been working at Whitmore's ranch for the past year as a housekeeper, that she'd heard things she wasn't meant to hear, that Whitmore had been talking in the past 2 weeks about Amelia in ways that had frightened her. Not threats, not direct ones, but the kind of talk that, in her experience, came before something bad. "What kind of talk?" Amelia said. "About your son," Clara said. "About how a woman alone on a ranch in a dispute wasn't a stable environment for a child. About welfare investigations." She paused. "He knows someone in the Territorial Welfare Office. He's been talking about filing a complaint. About your fitness." Amelia was very still. "A welfare complaint," she said. "About the situation. A woman unmarried, a child with no identified father, living in a ranch cookhouse in the middle of a legal dispute." Clara looked at her hands. "I know it sounds, I know it might not." "No," Amelia said. "Sounds exactly like something he would do." She thought about it, fast and clear the way she thought when the stakes were actual. A welfare complaint wouldn't succeed. She knew it wouldn't succeed. She'd been providing care for Ethan that any reasonable person could see was more than adequate. And Hennessy would testify to the stability of the situation, and Ferris could likely find the complaint baseless within a week. But the process of it, the investigation, the interviews, the temporary uncertainty about Ethan's custody, while it was being resolved, that was the weapon, not the outcome. That was Pell's strategy applied to something more personal than land. She looked at Clara. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara looked at the table. "Because I had a baby once," she said. "I was 20. The father left." She didn't elaborate, and Amelia didn't ask her to. "And someone helped me." Thought she stopped. "I don't know why exactly. Thought you should know what was coming." Amelia looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right? Are you safe coming here?" "I told him I was visiting my cousin," Clara said. "I'll go back tonight." "You don't have to go back." "I have nowhere else to go," Clara said simply. Amelia understood that. She understood it from the inside. "Do you want to?" she asked. "Go back?" Pause. "Not particularly." "Then don't," Amelia says. "We have work here if you want it. I'll talk to Hennessy tonight." Clara looked at her with an expression that she recognized, the particular look of someone who had been in a hard place for so long that an unexpected door was genuinely confusing. "I only came to warn you," Clara said. "I wasn't asking." "I know you weren't," Amelia said. "I'm asking you." Told Wyatt that evening. All of it, Clara, the welfare complaint, the strategy behind it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That's what the men in Millhaven were for. Not violence. Witnesses for the complaint. People who'd say they'd seen the situation." "Yes," she said, "Ferris can fight it." "I know." He looked at her. But fighting it means a process," she said. "Interviews. Assessments. People coming here and looking at Ethan and asking questions about his father and my situation. She kept her voice steady because she'd had 2 hours to process this before finding Wyatt, and she'd used the time well. I can manage it. I've managed worse. I know you have, he said. She looked at him. She'd been looking at him differently since the Blizzard conversation, since the night he'd come back from finding Rourke, since all the accumulated months of knowing exactly who he was when things were hard. She'd been carrying something she hadn't said, and she knew he'd been carrying the same something, and they'd both been careful about it. Careful in the particular way of two people who were afraid of being wrong about something they couldn't afford to be wrong about. She was tired of being careful. There's a simpler solution to the welfare complaint, she said. He looked at her. If I weren't unmarried, she said. The complaint loses most of its foundation. A stable home, an identified family structure. She stopped. He said nothing. I'm not asking, she said. I want to be clear. I'm identifying a legal reality. I've been doing that for weeks. This is another one, Amelia, he said. It's a practical solution, she said. You don't have to, he said, not harshly, just firmly. Stop treating it like a legal solution. She looked at him. I've been thinking about it since November, he said. Before any of this. Before Pell and the fire and the complaint. He was looking at her directly, with the expression that had no performance in it, just the thing itself. I wasn't going to do it like this. I was going to do it when the land thing was settled, when it didn't look like I was doing it because of the situation. She said nothing. But I'm not going to let you turn it into a strategy, he said. That's not what it is. She was quiet for a long moment. The cookhouse was warm, and the lamp was low, and outside the Montana night was doing what Montana nights did in March, which was remain cold and enormous and indifferent to everything happening under it. What is it then, she said. It's that I'd like you to stay, he said. Not at Hennessy's with me. He paused. I'm not good at saying this kind of thing. Probably do it wrong. You're not doing it wrong, she said. I haven't asked the question yet. No, she agreed. He looked at her. Will you marry me? It wasn't decorated. It wasn't what she'd imagined. Years ago, before the life she'd actually had, before the baby and the trunk and the trail and the cookhouse and the months of building something real in a place she hadn't chosen. But she'd learned something about what real was over the past year, and it was that it wasn't decorated. True. Yes, she said. The word landed in the room without fanfare, the way real things usually did, and then the fire cracked in the stove, and Ethan made a small sound from the back room and settled again. And the ranch went on making its nighttime sounds around them. And Wyatt looked at her with the expression she'd seen that one time when he'd actually smiled, the one that took 10 years off his face and made him look like a man who might, under the right circumstances, be entirely happy. Thought they might get there. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be smooth, and there was still Pell and the audit and the welfare complaint and all the practical difficulties that didn't stop being real just because something true had been said out loud. But it was a foundation. And she knew better than most what you could build on one of those. The audit results came on a Thursday the same day. Edmund Ferris rode in from Helena with the expression of a man carrying news he was genuinely pleased to deliver. W. Hadley's certifying credentials were fraudulent, not just for the Hennessy survey for 11 others, across 3 counties over 18 months, all filed on behalf of companies that trace back, through varying degrees of distance, to Garrison Pell. The Territorial Land Office had suspended Hadley's authority and referred the matter to the Federal Marshal's Office. Western Territorial Holdings' counterclaim on Hennessy's East Pasture was void. Every adjacent survey they had filed or planned to file was now under automatic review. Ferris set the documents on the table and said, "It's over." Hennessy read the papers twice, which was once more than he usually needed. Then he set them down and said nothing for a moment, which was how he processed things that mattered. "Pell?" Wyatt said. "The Marshal's office is looking at him," Ferris said. "I won't promise anything. Men with his resources have a way of surviving investigations. The land scheme is finished. He can't operate in this territory anymore without every filing being scrutinized from the first page." "And Whitmore," Amelia said. Ferris looked at her. "His connection to Western Territorial Holdings is documented in the federal record now. That doesn't automatically mean criminal liability. He was a partner, not the architect. But it means anyone he tries to do business with in this territory will know what he was involved in." He paused. The welfare complaint he filed was reviewed and rejected 2 days ago. The investigator found no grounds. She had known it would be rejected. She'd known it from the start. But hearing it, said plainly, in a room with people who had fought this alongside her, was something different from knowing it. She held Ethan on her hip. He was 11 months old now, solid and opinionated and deeply interested in Ferris's leather satchel, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just been put down. It was heavier than she'd realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she said, to Ferris, but also to the room. Ferris stayed for the midday meal, which Clara had helped prepare, and which was better than usual, because Amelia had been cooking the way she always cooked when things were uncertain thoroughly, as if feeding people well was itself a kind of answer to the world's unreliability. Clara had settled into the cookhouse over the past week, with the careful gratitude of someone still not quite believing the door was real. She and Pete had reached the particular understanding of two people who had both been managing things alone for too long, and found it easier with company. After the meal, after Ferris rode back toward Helena with a full stomach and a completed case, the ranch went about the business of a March afternoon, the particular lightness of a day when something difficult is resolved and the ordinary work is still there and somehow feels less heavy for it. Wyatt found Amelia at the southeast corner of the yard, standing at the edge of where the haystack had been. The burn mark was still visible on the ground, dark against the frost-pale grass. She wasn't doing anything, just looking at it. He came to stand beside her. "It'll grow over by summer," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't thinking about the grass." He waited. "I was thinking about the woman who sat on a trunk out on that trail," she said. 8 months ago. 9 now. She looked at the mark on the ground. She was so certain that everything was over, that she'd made the one wrong decision she couldn't come back from. She looked at him sideways. "And she was wrong," she said, "which I don't say about myself often, so mark it." He almost smiled, "The real one, the rare one." "Marked," he said. She looked back at the burned ground. There was something she'd been thinking about for weeks, since the blizzard conversation, since the night she'd asked him about his brother, something about the way the frontier worked on people, the particular education it offered, which was brutal and real, and didn't make allowances for what you'd expected your life to be. "I used to think that being left behind was the worst thing that could happen," she said, "that it meant you weren't worth staying for. I spent a long time carrying that." She paused. "But being left behind just meant I ended up somewhere else. And somewhere else turned out to be here." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. "Then I've been running in the same direction for 3 years, without stopping to see where I was." "I know," she said. "I don't think I would have stopped," he said, "if I hadn't found you on that trail." "You would have," she said. "Eventually, maybe," he said. But later he looked at her, and later would have been worse. She held his gaze. He had the particular quality, in moments like this, of a man who had stopped performing composure and was simply being honest, and she had learned that this was the rarest thing he offered anyone. She didn't take it lightly. "We should set a date," she said, "for the wedding. That's generally what you set a date for," she said. "Spring," he said. "When the ground's clear. April," she said. "Before the busy season starts and Hennessy can't spare anyone for a ceremony." "April," he agreed. Ethan, who had been conducting his own investigation of the burn mark at their feet, sat down abruptly in the grass and looked up at both of them, with the solemn attention he gave everything, as though he'd been listening and had opinions about the timeline, but was choosing to reserve judgment. "Approves," Wyatt said. "He's sitting in the mud," she said. "He approves from the mud," Wyatt said. She laughed, actually laughed. The full kind, the kind that had been in short supply for most of a year, and picked Ethan up and held him against her, despite the mud. And he grabbed her braid with one hand, and Wyatt's coat sleeve with the other, and the three of them stood at the edge of the burned ground in the March light, with the ranch going about its business around them. They married on the 14th of April, on a morning that was cold enough for coats, but clear enough for the light to be the particular gold that came in Montana spring. Ferris rode up from Helena because Hennessy asked him to, and he seemed to consider it worth the ride. Pete made the wedding food, which he approached with the competitive intensity he brought to all cooking, and which was, therefore, better than the occasion strictly required. Clara wore the dress Amelia had helped her mend the week before, and she cried during the ceremony in the straightforward way of someone who felt something and didn't see the point in hiding it. The hands cleaned up and stood in the yard and made the particular noise of men who are moved by something and are expressing it in the only vocabulary they have, which is loud and inarticulate and entirely genuine. Hennessy stood next to Amelia's right side, which was where the father stood, and she had not asked him to and he had not offered. He had simply appeared there that morning when she came out, and she had looked at him, and he had looked at the middle distance with the expression he used when he didn't want to discuss what he was doing. and that was the whole of it. The justice of the peace was a small man named Colton who had been doing frontier ceremonies for 20 years and had the brisk efficiency of someone who respected both the occasion and people's time. He said what needed saying. Wyatt said yes in the particular flat, certain way he said things he meant completely. Amelia said yes and looked at him when she said it and did not look away. Ethan sat on Pete's knee during the ceremony and ate a piece of bread and regarded the whole proceeding with his usual solemn attention, occasionally offering the bread to Pete, who accepted each time with appropriate gravity. When it was done and the yard was loud and the food was coming out and the March into April sky was enormous and blue above all of them, Amelia stood for a moment at the edge of it, just outside the noise, and took stock of what was around her. It wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't what she'd arranged from St. Louis with her careful letters and her cautious arithmetic of survival. The man was different. The place was different. The shape of the whole thing was nothing like the picture she'd carried west in her head. And yet she had a home. Not a roof over her head, she'd had that before, in various forms, but a home, in the sense of a place where people knew her name and what she was capable of and chose her anyway. Where Ethan would grow up knowing he was not an inconvenience to be accommodated, but a person who was wanted from the start. Where the burned patch in the southeast yard would grow over by summer and become just grass again, ordinary and unremarkable, and no one would need to remember what had been there. That was the thing she'd learned in the months between the trail and this yard, between the broken trunk and this morning. It wasn't about resilience, the way people talked about it, like it was a quality some people had and others didn't, something you were born with or built in childhood. It was simpler than that. It was just the decision made repeatedly to keep going. Not because you were certain things would improve. Not because you were strong in the way the stories always made the strong women strong. But because stopping was also a choice, and you looked at your son's face and you didn't make it. That was all. That was everything. Wyatt came through the noise and stood next to her, and they looked at the yard together, at the people they'd come to in a roundabout way, through mud and creek crossings, and 4 riders, and a fraudulent survey, and a burned haystack, and all the slow accumulated evidence of what 2 people were willing to do for each other. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him. At the face she'd been learning for 9 months. At the man who had gotten off his horse in the middle of nowhere because he'd decided what kind of man he wanted to be, and who had not once, in all the time since, made her regret trusting that decision. "About how glad I am the wagon train didn't slow down," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then the real smile came, the full one, the one that was rare precisely because it was real, and he said, "Me too." Ethan, released by Pete and now navigating the yard at speed on unsteady legs, arrived at their feet and grabbed Wyatt's trouser leg for balance and looked up at both of them with the expression of someone who had completed a difficult journey and found the destination satisfactory. Wyatt reached down and picked him up. The boy grabbed his collar with both hands and held on, and the 3 of them stood in the April light in the yard of a ranch that was theirs in all the ways that mattered, and the frontier went on being vast and cold and indifferent around them, the way it always had. It just wasn't something to be survived anymore. It was something to live in, and that, in the end, was the whole difference.